Ruth Whitfield snatched the photograph off the kitchen table before Dorothea's fingers could reach it. "That," Ruth said, holding the image up like evidence at a trial, "is the woman my brother paid for." She turned the photograph around so everyone in the room could see it, a young face, smooth and bright, a girl no older than 22. Then Ruth looked at Dorothea Crane standing in the doorway with her leather bag and her worn traveling coat and the particular stillness of a woman who has been insulted so many times she has stopped flinching. "And you," Ruth continued, her voice dropping to the kind of quiet that is worse than shouting, "are not her." Nobody in that kitchen said a word. Not the ranch hand near the stove. Not the young girl peering around the doorframe. Not Amos Whitfield himself, who stood with his hat in his hands and his jaw set like a man waiting for a storm he'd already decided he couldn't stop. That silence, that specific, terrible silence, was the moment Dorothea understood exactly what she had walked into. If you have ever traveled 1,000 miles toward a life that turned its back on you the moment you arrived, then you already know what this story is about. And if you haven't, stay with us. Because what happens next inside that ranch house is the kind of thing people in Kessler Flats still talk about, even now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let us go back to the beginning. The stagecoach from Millhaven reached Kessler Flats at 2:30 in the afternoon, running 40 minutes behind schedule because one of the rear wheels had developed a crack somewhere outside of Denton Crossing, and the driver had spent the better part of an hour arguing with a passenger about whether they should stop to fix it or press on. They pressed on. The wheel held, but barely, and when the coach finally rolled to a stop in front of the Kessler Flats depot, it listed slightly to the right, like a man who has been walking too long on a bad leg. Dorothea Crane was the last one off. She had learned over the years to let others go first. Not because she was timid, because watching the way people move when they think nobody important is looking tells you almost everything you need to know about them. The young couple near the front scrambled out with the particular urgency of people who had somewhere to be. The older gentleman in the gray coat stepped down carefully, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other guarding his hat against the wind. A woman with 2 children waited until her youngest was handed down before she moved at all. Dorothea watched all of this. Then she picked up her leather bag and her tin recipe box, small battered one she had carried since before her first marriage, its latch repaired twice with wire, and she stepped out into the late afternoon sun of a town she had never seen in her life. Kessler Flats was not what she had imagined from the letters. The letters had described a prosperous settlement, a town growing into itself, full of opportunity and expansion. What she saw was accurate enough, technically. There were 2 mercantile shops, a hotel that looked recently repainted, a doctor's office, a bank with a new sign above the door. But there was also something underneath all of that, a particular kind of dust that settles into the grain of a place and suggests that whatever prosperity exists here is being held together by effort rather than luck. She stood on the depot platform and looked at it all for a moment before a voice behind her said, "You the woman from Millhaven?" Turned. The man was not Amos Whitfield. She knew that immediately, not because she had a photograph of Amos, she did not. She'd only received a physical description in a letter, but because this man was too young and too uncertain. He had the look of someone who had been sent to do an errand he wasn't sure he'd be able to complete. "I am," Dorothea said. The young man, a ranch hand, from the cut of his clothes, and the particular way he stood with his weight, shifted back on his heels, looked her over once with the careful blankness of a person trying very hard not to show his reaction. He was not entirely successful. "I'm Cole," he said. "I work for Mr. Whitfield. He asked me to collect you and bring you out to the ranch." "That's kind of him," Dorothea said. Cole picked up her bag without being asked, which was a mark in his favor, and led her toward a wagon parked along the side of the depot building. The tin recipe box she kept in her own hands. The drive out to the Whitfield ranch took just over an hour. Cole talked some about the weather, about the condition of the roads in the rainy season, about a stretch of fence line along the north pasture that had been giving them trouble. He talked the way people do when they're trying to fill a silence and aren't sure what the silence means. Dorothea let him. She asked a question here and there, enough to keep him comfortable, but mostly she watched the land. It was enormous. She had known, intellectually, from the letters, that the Whitfield Ranch was one of the largest in the territory. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and seeing it. The moment Cole turned the wagon off the main road and through a gate marked with the Whitfield brand, the scale of it hit her, the way wide-open spaces always hit people who have spent years living in tighter circumstances, like a door opening that you didn't know was closed. The main house appeared at the end of a long track, framed by cottonwoods that had been there long enough to substantial, their trunks thick and their canopies spreading. The house itself was large by any measure, 2 full stories, a wide porch along the front, outbuildings arranged behind it, with the organized logic of a man who thinks carefully about function. It had the bones of a place built with real intention. But something was off. Dorothea could not have named it precisely in that first moment, but she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds appear. The porch was cluttered with things that should have been put away. One of the window shutters on the upper floor had a hinge loose, the shutter sitting at a slight angle, and no one had corrected it. The flower beds along the front of the house were there, the shape of them, the edges, but they hadn't been tended in a long time. The house had been built by someone who cared, and then something had happened, and the caring had stopped. Cole pulled the wagon up and climbed down, and Dorothea followed, and that was when the front door opened and Ruth Whitfield appeared. She was maybe 50, sharp-featured, with the straight back of a woman who had decided some years ago that posture was a form of argument. She wore a dark dress, practical and unadorned, and she looked at Dorothea coming down from the wagon the way a judge looks at evidence that contradicts the verdict she's already written. "That's all you brought?" Ruth said, looking at the leather bag and the tin box. "I travel light," Dorothea said. Ruth's expression tightened by a small degree. "Come inside, then. Amos is waiting." The interior of the house confirmed what the exterior had suggested. Everything of quality, good furniture, solid construction, real curtains in the windows rather than the improvised fabric a lot of ranch houses made do with. And underneath all of it, the same invisible neglect. The floor had been swept but not scrubbed. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon light in a way that made the rooms feel closed. A layer of ordinary life sat on top of everything like sediment, undisturbed. Amos Whitfield was in the main room near the fireplace, and the first thing Dorothea noticed was that he was a large man, not fat, but built the way some men are built, who have spent their lives doing physical work, thick through the shoulders and chest, with hands that looked like they had more experience, with reins and fencing tools than anything delicate. He was maybe 45. He had a good face, or had the structure for one. There was something in the jaw and around the eyes that might have been called handsome if it hadn't been carrying so much weight. He looked at her, and she could see the calculation happening, fast and practiced, the way a man who buys and sells livestock learns to assess what's in front of him. She could see, immediately after the calculation, the result. His expression didn't change. That was the tell. Men who are pleased with what they see let it show, even just slightly. Amos Whitfield looked at Dorothea Crane and kept his face perfectly, carefully neutral, which meant the calculation had not come out the way he'd hoped. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "I'm Amos Whitfield." "Mr. Whitfield," she said. Pause not long, but present. "You had a good journey?" he asked. "Adequate," she said. One of the wheels needed attention, and the driver chose not to stop for it. "We arrived late." Amos nodded slowly. "Cole brought your bags?" "Bag," she said, singular. Ruth, who had followed them in and stationed herself near the doorway as though guarding it, made a small sound that was not quite a scoff. Almost, but she pulled it back at the last second. That was when Amos crossed to the table and picked up the photograph. Dorothea had wondered if this moment would happen, and how. She had written to a solicitor in Millhaven some months ago, responding to an advertisement placed through a matchmaking arrangement that a woman in her church circle had mentioned. The photograph that had been sent as part of the arrangement, she had never seen it. She had sent her own. She had been honest about her age, 38, and her situation, widowed, and her circumstances, modest. Whether all of that information had traveled intact through whatever process brought it to Kessler Flats, she had no way to know until this moment. Amos held the photograph but did not show it to her. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "There seems to be some—" he started. "Let me see it," Ruth said, and crossed the room and took the photograph from her brother's hand with the particular authority of a woman who considers herself entitled to involve herself in anything within reach. She looked at the photograph. She looked at Dorothea. Something shifted in Ruth's face, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of satisfaction, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific kind of problem to arrive and has now seen it confirmed. Ruth set the photograph on the table, facing out, so Dorothea could see it. The young woman in the photograph was perhaps 22, light-haired, small-featured, with the slightly formal posture of someone who knew their picture was being taken and was trying to look their best. It was not a photograph of Dorothea Crane. Someone, Ruth said, precisely, sent the wrong woman. The silence that followed was the one Dorothea would carry with her. For a long time after the specific quality of it, the way the ranch hand near the stove suddenly found somewhere else to look, the way the child's face disappeared from the doorway. And then Ruth said the rest of it, holding up the photograph like evidence, her voice dropping to that particular quiet that is worse than shouting. That is the woman my brother paid for, and you are not her. Dorothea Crane did not cry. She had cried before plenty of times at things that deserved it. She had cried when her first husband died, leaving her with a house that turned out to have more debt attached to it than she'd known about. She had cried when she sold that house, and again when she moved into her sister's spare room for a year while she figured out what came next. She had cried once, in a mercantile in Millhaven, when she counted out what she had in her coin purse and discovered it was not quite enough for what she'd come to buy. And she'd had to put something back, and the woman behind her in line had seen it happen. She was acquainted with humiliation. She knew its particular texture. So she stood in Amos Whitfield's main room, Ruth Whitfield, holding up a photograph of a stranger, and she did not cry. She also did not apologize, which was the other reflex she'd learned to suppress. She had not done anything wrong. She had not sent the wrong photograph. She did not know how the confusion had occurred, whether the solicitor had made an error, whether someone else had withdrawn from the arrangement, and she had been offered as a replacement, whether there was some other explanation she was not yet in possession of, but she knew with complete certainty that she had not deceived anyone. I sent my own photograph, Dorothea said, and her voice came out even, and my correct particulars. 38 years old, widowed, from Millhaven. If there has been an error, it wasn't made on my end. Ruth's eyes narrowed. Then it's a remarkable coincidence that you show up here, and the young woman in that photograph does not. I agree, Dorothea said. It is remarkable. Be curious to know how it happened myself. This was not the response Ruth had expected. She had expected, Dorothea thought, one of two things: collapse or aggression. Either a tearful apology and immediate retreat, or a defensive argument that could be easily overcome. Calm agreement with the essential problem, offered without self-incrimination, was harder to deal with. Amos had been quiet during this exchange. He was watching Dorothea with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not warm, exactly, but not hostile either. More like a man who is used to making rapid assessments and has found himself, for once, uncertain. You'll need to stay the night, he said finally. The stagecoach back to Millhaven doesn't run until Thursday. Tuesday, Dorothea said. Yes. Another pause. There's a room, Amos said. He did not say it generously. He said it the way a man says things that are simply the logistical facts of a situation. Stairs on the right. Ruth will show you. Ruth looked at her brother, as though she had several things to say about this and was choosing not to say any of them right now. Then she turned and walked toward the stairs without checking to see if Dorothea was following. Dorothea picked up her leather bag and her tin recipe box and followed. The room was adequate. That was the honest word for it. There was a bed, properly made, with sheets that had been laundered at some point in the recent past. A washstand with a pitcher and basin. A small window that looked out over the side yard toward one of the outbuildings, where she could see a man moving between a large structure she took to be a barn and a smaller one beside it. Ruth set nothing down, adjusted nothing, made no gesture toward hospitality. She stood in the doorway of the room as Dorothea set her bag on the floor beside the bed and placed the tin recipe box on the washstand. You should know, Ruth said, that my brother is a serious man. He runs a serious operation. He does not have time for complications. No one does, Dorothea said. What he needs. Ruth stopped herself, reconsidered, started again. What this family needs is someone specific, someone capable of managing a household of this size. Who has the right? She paused, choosing words carefully. Temperament. And you don't think I have the right temperament, Dorothea said. I think you're 38 years old with a worn-out bag and a tin box, and you're supposed to be replacing my brother's wife. The word replacing sat in the air between them. I'm not replacing anyone, Dorothea said quietly. No one can do that. I was told the arrangement was for a companion and household partner. That's a different thing. Ruth studied her for a moment with the look of a woman trying to find the angle and not quite finding it. Then she said, "Supper's at 6," and left. Dorothea sat down on the edge of the bed, and listened to Ruth's footsteps go down the hall, then the stairs. She looked at the tin recipe box on the washstand. It had belonged to her grandmother before it was hers, and before that it had belonged to someone else, someone far enough back that the name had been lost. The outside was dented in 2 places and the latch was the wire replacement, not the original. Inside were 52 cards, written in 4 different hands across 3 generations, recipe instructions and notes, and small observations that had nothing to do with cooking. At all things like the key is patience, not heat, and don't be afraid of the dark parts. They have the most flavor. She had read those cards so many times she knew most of them by memory. She was not going back to Millhaven on Thursday. She did not know sitting on that bed exactly what she was going to do instead. But she knew that much with the particular certainty that sometimes arrives before the plan does. Supper that first night was a demonstration, not of anything gracious. The food was edible, a stew of some kind that had been over-seasoned with salt and under-seasoned with everything else. Bread that was several hours past its best moment. Coffee that had been left on the heat too long and tasted accordingly. The woman who had cooked it, a hired girl named Vera who appeared to be around 19 and had the harried look of someone doing a job she had not been adequately prepared for, came and went from the kitchen with the specific anxiety of a person waiting to be told they'd done something wrong. Dorothea sat at the far end of the table and said very little. Amos sat at the head. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who treats meals as necessary maintenance rather than occasions. Ruth sat to his left and cut her bread with a precise, controlled motion that conveyed a great deal without conveying anything she could be called on. 2 children sat across from each other in the middle of the table. The boy Cooper was maybe 8. He was slight for his age in the way that suggests not illness exactly, but insufficient appetite, the kind of slight that comes from a child who hasn't been eating enough without anyone quite knowing why. He looked at the stew, pushed it around his bowl a few times, and ate without much engagement. The girl May was perhaps 11 or 12. She watched Dorothea with the direct, unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to observe things. Not hostile, just watching. No one introduced them to Dorothea. No one said their names at the table. She learned them by listening. Amos spoke to the boy twice briefly about something related to a horse and called him Cooper both times. The girl he called May once to pass the bread. After supper, the children disappeared. Ruth cleared the table with the same precise, controlled motion she'd applied to the bread, and Amos went somewhere outside, by the sound of the door, and Dorothea was left in the kitchen with Vera, who was washing up with the defeated energy of someone who does the same thing every evening and finds it exhausting every time. "How long have you been here?" Dorothea asked. Vera startled slightly, as though she hadn't expected to be spoken to. 7 months, she said. "Since March. And before you, who cooked?" Vera was quiet for a moment. "There was another woman, Mrs. Hensley. She left last February." Before her, Vera shrugged, a small, careful gesture. "Mr. Whitfield's wife passed some years back. I think after that it was different people for a while. I don't know all of it." Dorothea nodded. She picked up a dish towel and began drying the bowl Vera had just washed. Vera glanced at her sideways, uncertain whether this was appropriate, then decided not to say anything about it. The boy Dorothea said, "Cooper, he doesn't eat much." "He never does," Vera said. "Mr. Whitfield has had the doctor out twice about it. The doctor says there's nothing physically wrong with him. He just—" She stopped. "Just what?" "He just doesn't seem to want to," Vera said finally. "To eat, or to do much of anything, really. He's a quiet boy." Dorothea dried another bowl. "And Miss May?" she asked. Vera's expression shifted to something slightly softer. "She's clever. Reads everything she can get her hands on. She used to follow her mother around the kitchen, or so I've heard." A pause. "She doesn't spend much time in the kitchen now." Dorothea looked around the kitchen, the range which needed blacking, at the shelves which had a decent stock of basic supplies, but nothing interesting, the inventory of a person cooking for survival rather than pleasure. The window above the wash basin, which had a sill deep enough to grow herbs in if anyone had thought to try. No one had thought to try. That night, lying in the room that was adequate, Dorothea stared at the ceiling and did what she always did in the hours before sleep. She thought through what she had seen and sorted it. The ranch was prosperous. That was real and visible in the quality of the construction, the size of the operation, the deference Cole had shown toward Amos when he spoke of the ranch's function. The house was failing. Not structurally, the beams and walls were sound. But a house is not just its construction. A house is its habits, its rhythms, the way people moved through it and toward each other. And the habits of this house had collapsed somewhere along the way, and no one had rebuilt them. Amos Whitfield had money and land and a reputation. He also had a son who had decided not to eat, a daughter who had stopped spending time in the kitchen, where her mother had once been, a hired girl cooking meals she had never been taught to make well, and a house that looked cared for from outside and hollow from within. He was not a cruel man. Dorothea had catalogued that over the course of the evening, spoke to the children without warmth, but also without harshness. He didn't humiliate Vera in front of anyone. He had offered Dorothea a room without being asked to, and without making a performance of the charity. He was a man who had learned to manage things, who dealt with problems by containing them, organizing them, keeping them from getting worse. Not a man who knew how to make things better, specifically, actively better, in the way that requires sitting with a thing and understanding what it needs. That was a different skill, and it was not one you developed by being wealthy. Thursday Stagecoach would leave Kessler Flats in 2 days. Dorothea looked at the tin recipe box on the washstand, just visible in the dark by the faint light from the window. "Don't be afraid of the dark parts," the card said. "They have the most flavor." She closed her eyes. In the morning she was up before Vera. This was not strategy. She was an early riser by nature and by decades of practice, the kind of early that arrives before the light has fully committed itself. Went downstairs and had the range going by. The time Vera appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking startled and then guilty, as though she had been caught sleeping through something she was supposed to have managed. "I'll take care of breakfast," Dorothea said. "You can set the table." Vera opened her mouth, looked uncertain, and then decided this was not a battle she needed to fight. Dorothea had brought 3 things in the tin recipe box besides the cards. A small paper parcel of spice mixture she had put together herself before leaving Millhaven, not because she expected to use it immediately, but because she always carried some form of it the way other people carry a lucky coin. A dried pepper, dark and wrinkled, of a variety she'd found at a market 2 years earlier, that no one in Millhaven had been able to tell her the name of. And 3 small bulbs of garlic, because the card in her grandmother's handwriting said garlic cures more things than doctors admit, and she had long since stopped questioning it. She found eggs. She found potatoes that were past their best but workable. She found onions. She found a block of salt pork that had more fat on it than meat, which was fine fat was the point. She made breakfast. It was not elaborate. It was not fantasy. It was the kind of breakfast that requires knowing a few things about heat and timing, and the difference between what something smells like when it's almost right versus when it's exactly right. Small knowledge, kind that comes from repetition and attention rather than instruction. When the family came down one by one, the kitchen smelled different than it had the night before. Cooper came first, ahead of May, ahead of Amos, which surprised Dorothea because she had assessed him as a child who preferred to avoid the main spaces of the house. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there for a moment, with his head slightly lifted, and Dorothea saw something happen in his face, not excitement, nothing so large, but a small brightening, the particular expression of a person who has encountered something they weren't expecting. She put a plate in front of him without comment. He ate it. All of it. Dorothea kept her attention on the range and did not make a production of noticing. But she noticed. Amos came in last. He looked at the range, at the plates already set out, at Vera standing near the washstand with the air of someone who has already been relieved of responsibility and isn't sure how to stand without it. He looked at Dorothea. "Mrs. Crane," he said. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and put a plate in front of him. He sat. He looked at the plate. He picked up his fork. Ruth, who had been watching all of this from just inside the doorway, with an expression that suggested she was cataloging it for future reference, said, "She has no business being in this kitchen." "She made breakfast," Cooper said. Everyone looked at Cooper, who had spoken, had actually volunteered a sentence in a room full of adults, without apparent self-consciousness. He appeared slightly surprised himself. "I noticed," Amos said, picked up his fork again and ate. Ruth found Dorothea in the garden that afternoon. Or rather, Ruth found Dorothea standing at the edge of what had once been a kitchen garden, and was now a collection of former intentions. Posts were still in place. The remnants of a few hardy perennials had survived years of neglect, stubborn and unkempt. The soil in the beds was compacted in the way of earth that hasn't been turned in a long time. "What are you doing?" Ruth asked. "Looking," Dorothea said. "At what?" At what this was. She crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil near the base of a woody, overgrown plant she was fairly certain had once been sage. The earth crumbled away from her fingers. It still had some life in it, and at what it could be. Ruth made the almost scoff sound again. That garden hasn't been kept up since Eleanor died. Eleanor Amos's wife. The first time anyone had said the name in her presence. When did she die? Dorothea asked. 4 years ago, Ruth said. She had the clipped delivery of someone who has made a private decision not to be affected by a thing and enforces that decision rigidly. Fewer than that, since everyone stopped trying. Dorothea stood. She brushed the earth from her fingers. What was she like? Dorothea asked. Not because she was being strategic, because she genuinely wanted to know. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence something happened to her face that was different from anything Dorothea had seen in it, before a small break like a seam slightly giving. It was very capable, Ruth said finally, organized. Kitchen was always. She kept the kitchen very well. And the children loved her, Dorothea said. It wasn't a question. Obviously, Ruth said, and the break closed back up and her voice went flat again. Everyone did. She turned and walked back toward the house. Dorothea stood in the ruined garden and looked at the compacted earth and the surviving sage and the posts still waiting in place. She understood something now that she hadn't before. Problem was not that Eleanor was gone. People die, and the living eventually manage. Problem was that no one in this house had been permitted to make anything new. The children had been given the ghost of a home, preserved and honored, while the actual home, the living, changing, imperfect, ongoing thing had been quietly dismantled. And Amos Whitfield, who was very good at managing problems, had managed this one by holding everything still. You cannot hold grief still. It finds a way to move anyway, usually sideways, usually somewhere inconvenient. Dorothea looked at the ruined garden and made a decision she had probably already made the night before, lying on the bed in the adequate room. She was not going back to Millhaven on Thursday. Told Amos that evening. He was in the small room off the main hall that served as his office, a practical space, maps on the wall, ledgers on the desk, a chair for guests that had clearly seen little use. She knocked on the open door, and he looked up from whatever he'd been writing. Mr. Whitfield, she said, I'd like to stay. He set down his pen. The expression he turned toward her was careful, the same calibrated neutrality she had noted the first day, except this time she thought she could see something working behind it. Your circumstances make that difficult, he said. The arrangement that was agreed upon was for a companion and household partner, Dorothea said. That's what I am. I'm 38, not 22, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I'm also not the woman who arrived in that stagecoach and got told she was the wrong answer to a question and should go home in 2 days. She paused. I have skills this house needs. You can see that already from this morning, and I'd like the chance to demonstrate the rest. Amos was quiet. What is it you want? He asked. Genuinely asking. It was a better question than she'd expected from him, and she answered it honestly. I want to be useful, she said. I want to be somewhere that's made better because I'm in it. I had a marriage once that was a good one, and I lost it, and I've been looking, I suppose, for the next version of what that meant. Place people. She stopped herself before she said more than was necessary. I don't need it to be perfect from the start. I know what things look like when they're being built. Amos looked at her for a long moment. Ruth won't approve, he said. Ruth will come around, Dorothea said. Or she won't. Either way, I don't think she's actually who I'm asking. Something shifted in his face, not a smile, but the precondition for one. A slight involuntary relaxation somewhere around the eyes. You can stay through the month, he said. After that, we'll assess. That's fair, Dorothea said. She turned to leave and he said, Mrs. Crane, she stopped. Breakfast this morning, he said. Cooper ate. I noticed, she said. He hasn't. He stopped, and she could see him choosing his words with the specific care of a man who doesn't talk about certain things often. He hasn't eaten a full meal in a long time, the doctor said. He stopped again. I know what the doctor said, Dorothea said. There's nothing physically wrong with him. He just doesn't want to. Amos looked at her. How do you know that? Vera told me, and I watched him at supper last night. She thought about saying more, about what she had seen some boy's face when he came into the kitchen that morning, about what she understood now, about the ghost of a house and the living children inside it. But some things are better demonstrated than explained, and she had only been given a month. Good night, Mr. Whitfield, she said, and went upstairs. First week passed in the way of weeks that are full of small events that don't seem significant individually, but add up to something. Dorothea cooked every meal. Vera, initially uncertain, eventually settled into something like relief. She continued to assist, to wash up, to set the table. The creative responsibility had been lifted from her, and she seemed to uncoil slightly without it, the harried edge softening. The food was better. This was simply true. Dorothea was not a chef in any formal sense. She had no training beyond what the kitchen had given her. Starting from when she was old enough to stand on a box beside her grandmother and stir things without being told to stop. But she had 40 years of accumulated attention, which is its own kind of expertise. Cooper ate everything she put in front of him, not always with enthusiasm, but with consistency, which was the more important thing. He began to look slightly less gaunt around the face. May started appearing in the kitchen, not asking to help, not initially. Just appearing, the way children appear in spaces where something interesting is happening, with the slightly too casual demeanor of someone who wants to be somewhere, but doesn't want to admit to wanting it. Dorothea saw her and said nothing about her being there, and did nothing to make the kitchen feel formal or supervised. 3 days in, May said, "What are you making?" And that was the beginning of something. Ruth continued to be difficult in ways that were technically within the bounds of ordinary household disagreement, but clearly intended to communicate her position. She questioned Dorothea's choices about provisions. She pointedly observed twice that certain things had always been done a particular way on the Whitfield ranch. She mentioned Eleanor's name in contexts that made clear she was measuring Dorothea against an absent standard. Dorothea did not engage with any of this directly. She was not performing patience. She was actually patient, which is a different thing, harder to sustain and harder to counterfeit. Amos watched. This was the clearest thing about him. Once she'd had a few days to calibrate, he was an observer, a man who gathered information before he spoke or acted, who maintained his stillness as a way of seeing more clearly. She respected it, even when she suspected he was watching her specifically, assessing whether the month's trial was trending one way or another. It was on the 9th day that the thing with the onion happened. She had decided to make broth, not a fancy broth, kind of deep, serious broth that requires time and attention and particular knowledge, the kind that her grandmother made, which was the basis of about a third of the cards in the tin box. The recipe was not complicated to read. It was complicated to execute because it required several things that felt wrong at the moment of doing them. The onion was one of them. She cut the onion in half, crosswise, and placed the cut sides down on the dry surface of the cast iron pan, and turned the heat under it until the exposed flesh went from white to amber to, eventually, a deep, serious brown that was not quite burning, but was close enough to look like a mistake to anyone watching. The smoke was the problem. It wasn't a lot of smoke, but it was present, and it had a particular quality, and Amos, who had come in from outside, for some purpose she would never know, walked into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at the pan. He looked at the smoke. He looked at Dorothea, who was standing at the range with a kitchen cloth over her shoulder, entirely calm. "What are you doing to my kitchen?" he said. "Making broth," she said. "You're burning something." "No," she said, "I'm charring. There's a difference." She used the tongs to lift one of the onion halves and showed him the cut surface dark and caramelized across the face, not destroyed, not ruined. The cells broken down and transformed rather than simply burned. He stared at it. "That looks ruined." "It looks like that," she agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment, standing in the kitchen doorway. She could see him working through whether to say something more, whether to intervene in some way, whether this was one of those situations that required management. "How does burning an onion make better broth?" he said finally. She lowered the onion half back onto the pan. "Because the browning creates compounds that don't exist in raw or gently cooked onion. They're bitter on their own, which is why people avoid them. But when they're dissolved into a long-cooked stock, they add depth that you can't get any other way." She paused. Sometimes the thing that tastes wrong in isolation is exactly what the whole needs. He looked at her. She held his gaze. He said, "All right," and left the kitchen. She stood at the range and let out a breath she hadn't entirely realized she'd been holding. The broth cooked for 4 hours after that. The house filled with a smell that was different from anything it had produced. In the time Dorothea had been there, something older and deeper, and more serious. The smell of something done with real intention over real time. When she brought it to the table that evening, no one said anything for the first few minutes. They just ate. Vera ate. Ruth ate without comment, without the precise controlled motion of judgment, just eating the way a person eats when they have forgotten, briefly, that they're supposed to be evaluating something. Cooper lifted his bowl when it was empty and looked at Dorothea, and she ladled more without making him ask twice. May said, "How did you make it taste like that?" "Like what?" Dorothea said. May thought for a moment. "Like something that matters," she said. And that was when Amos Whitfield, at the head of his table in his house, in Kessler Flats with his family around him, set down his spoon and looked at Dorothea Crane with an expression that was not calculating, and not neutral, and not careful at all. It was the expression of a man who has just understood something he didn't understand before. Picked up his spoon again. He finished the bowl. He set the spoon down a second time. And then quietly, without any fanfare, he said, "May I have more?" Those 3 words, "May I have more," were not a large thing, measured by any ordinary standard. Amos Whitfield said them quietly, without ceremony, the way a man says something when he has stopped thinking about how it sounds and is only thinking about whether it's true. He said them to a woman he had not chosen, in a kitchen that had not been functioning properly in years, over a broth made by charring an onion in a way that had looked, 20 minutes earlier, like a mistake. And yet something in the room changed when he said them. Dorothea ladled more broth into his bowl without making a production of it. She did not smile in a way that announced its own significance. She did not look at Ruth. She simply filled the bowl and set it back in front of him, and returned to her place near the range, and the meal continued, and no one said anything about it. But it had been said, and in a house where very little had been said honestly in a long time, the weight of it settled somewhere into the walls and stayed there. Ruth noticed. Of course she did. Ruth noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it in whatever internal system she maintained for tracking developments she considered relevant to her brother's welfare. She noticed, and she said nothing, and that silence was its own form of response. Miss May noticed too, though she was 11, and could not have articulated what she was observing with any precision. She simply felt it the way children feel the temperature of a room without understanding the mechanics of heat, and she looked at Dorothea for a moment longer than usual before going back to her broth. Cooper ate his second bowl with the same quiet concentration he brought to everything, and asked to be excused when he was done, and Amos nodded, and the boy disappeared, which was normal. But he had eaten 2 full bowls. That was not normal. That was, by recent standards, something close to a small miracle, and everyone at the table knew it, and no one said so. The dishes were cleared. The kitchen was put back in order. The house settled into the particular quiet of a place where people have gone to their separate corners for the night. And Dorothea sat for a while at the kitchen table after Vera had gone to bed, and the fire in the range had dropped to embers. And she looked at her tin recipe box and thought about what came next. She had bought herself more time. Not much a month was a month, and the month had 3 weeks left in it. But time in her experience was rarely the actual constraint. The actual constraint was almost always whether you were willing to do the uncomfortable thing that the situation required, and whether you could recognize what that thing was before it was too late to do it. The house required more than food. She had known that from the first day. Food was the entry point. Food was always the entry point, because hunger is honest in a way that most human needs are not. Feed people well, and their defenses lower by degrees. Not because they've decided to trust you, but because the body overrules the head. But feeding people was not the same as rebuilding what this house had lost, and Dorothea was not confused about the difference. What the Whitfield Ranch had lost was harder to name and harder to restore. It had lost its habits of warmth, not the dramatic, visible warmth of celebration. There were probably celebrations here, Christmas and the occasional gathering, moments when the house roused itself into some approximation of liveliness. What it had lost was the daily warmth, the ordinary warmth, the kind that consists of 100 small things done with attention, a window left open at the right hour, a meal time to when people are actually hungry, rather than when the clock says they should be. A conversation started because someone noticed something and said so. The warmth that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The warmth that is simply the texture of a well-kept life. Eleanor Whitfield had apparently known how to create this, and when she died, it had died with her. Because no one else in the house had understood how it worked, had understood that it was a skill, not a personality trait, not something some people simply have, and others simply don't. Skill, learned from watching and doing, the way all real skills are. Dorothea knew it because she had learned it herself, in a different house, a different life, with a husband who had been good in the particular ways that counted, and not particularly good in several others, which was the honest truth of most marriages. She had learned it the way the cards in the tin box represented learning iteratively, imperfectly, with a lot of corrections along the way. She was not Eleanor Whitfield. She was not trying to be. That was a door that should stay closed, and she understood it with complete clarity. She was trying to build something new. And new things, in her experience, always encountered resistance before they encountered acceptance. The resistance arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after she'd come to the ranch, in the form of a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She had been in the kitchen garden, the ruined one, where she had begun working the soil in the late afternoon when the sun came off it enough to make the work comfortable. She had found a spade in the tool shed and had been turning the compacted earth, loosening it, pulling up the dead matter that had been sitting in the beds for years. It was hard physical work, and she was good at it, the kind of good that comes from not minding the discomfort. Kitchen window was open above her. She heard Ruth's voice first, which was not a surprise. Ruth spoke with the particular carrying quality of a woman who has spent a lifetime being certain her opinions should reach their destination. 11 days, Amos. 11 days and she has made herself completely at home. Pause. Amos's voice, lower, less distinct from where Dorothea was crouching in the garden. She caught the tone measured, not conceding but not pushing back hard either. She is at home, Ruth said. That's the problem. She walked into this house, and within 2 weeks she has her hands in everything. Kitchen, the garden, the children. Another pause. May follows her around like a puppy, Ruth said. And Cooper, you've seen how he is with her. He talks to her, Amos. He doesn't talk to anyone. More from Amos, still too low to catch the words. I'm not saying she doesn't have some usefulness, Ruth said, and the word usefulness came out with the particular emphasis of a word chosen to diminish. I'm saying she's positioning herself. You can see it if you're paying attention. Came here in circumstances that should have sent her back on the next stagecoach, and instead of leaving, she made herself indispensable. Doesn't that strike you as calculated? Dorothea stayed very still in the garden. She had turned the spade over, and was holding it without doing anything with it, and she was looking at the dark earth she had been uncovering. And she was listening. She's a 40-year-old woman with nothing, Ruth said. No husband, no money, no real prospects. This ranch is the best she will ever see. Of course she's trying to stay. The question is whether you're going to let her. This time Amos's response was longer, and Dorothea caught fragments. Something about the children. Something about giving it time. Something she couldn't make out. Time, Ruth said, and there was a specific kind of exasperation in it. The kind that comes from a person who believes they are watching a slow-motion mistake and cannot stop it. You give her more time, and in 2 months, you'll be unable to remove her without a scene. She knows that. She is counting on it. Dorothea set the spade down carefully in the garden bed and stood up. She was 38 years old, not 40. She noted this with the specific dry accuracy of someone who has decided that being clear about her own facts matters more than the comfort of letting the error pass. She looked at the open kitchen window for a moment. Then she picked the spade up and kept turning the earth and let the conversation finish without her. That evening she made a decision that would have looked, to an observer, like a small domestic gesture. She asked May to help her in the kitchen, not as a lesson, not framed as instruction or improvement or anything purposeful. She said, I'm going to make something complicated tonight, and I could use an extra pair of hands. And May, who had been drifting in and out of the kitchen for days waiting to be asked, said yes immediately, with a casualness that didn't quite cover how much she wanted to. What they made was pie. Not a simple one. A proper frontier pie, the kind that requires making pastry from scratch, which requires knowing how to work cold fat into flour without overworking it, requires understanding that the goal is flakiness, and flakiness comes from layering, not from thoroughness. May did not know this. She started working the dough with the focused intensity of a girl who wants to do things correctly and compensates for uncertainty with effort. Slower, Dorothea said. Lighter hands. You're not trying to beat it into submission. How do I know when it's right? May asked. When it starts to look shaggy, but holds together if you press it. You'll feel when it changes. What does it feel like? Dorothea thought about how to describe it. Like the difference between wet sand and dry sand, she said. You can feel the texture shift. You'll know it. May went back to work with slightly lighter hands. After a few minutes, she said, like this? Dorothea looked. Almost right. One more turn, she said, then stop. May made one more turn. Then she looked at Dorothea, checking. That's it, Dorothea said. May looked at the dough in the bowl with an expression that was trying very hard to be merely interested and was not entirely succeeding. There was something else in it, a kind of recognition, like a person seeing a familiar landscape from a new angle. My mother used to make pie, May said. She said it the way people say things that cost them something carefully, with precise control over the words, as though the sentence might do something unexpected if she let it out wrong. I know, Dorothea said. May looked at her. How do you know? Vera told me you used to follow her around in the kitchen. Dorothea turned to the apples she'd been peeling, kept her hands moving. Spent a lot of time in here. May was quiet. It's not the same, May said after a moment. No, Dorothea said. It's not. Does it bother you? That people probably compare you to her? It was a direct question, the kind only children and very old people ask without the usual social negotiation. Dorothea considered it honestly. It probably should bother me more than it does, she said. But I'm not trying to be her, I can't be. And this, she gestured, slightly, with the paring knife, indicating the kitchen, the dough, the two of them standing there. This isn't a competition with a dead woman. Just supper. May thought about this. Ruth thinks you're trying to take her place. Ruth can think what she wants, Dorothea said. What do you think? A long pause. I think you make Cooper eat, May said finally, and that nobody else has figured out how to do that. Not even the doctor. Dorothea set the peeled apple aside and started on the next one. He just needed something that tasted like it was made for him. Kids know the difference between food that was made with attention and food that was made because somebody had to. Is that why you burn the onion? May said. Because you're paying attention? Partly, Dorothea said. And partly because it actually works. Something loosened in May's face. Not quite a smile, more like the precondition for, one, the same structural relaxation she had noticed in Amos that evening. He had surprised himself with those 3 quiet words. They finished the pie without talking much more, which was fine. Sometimes the talking isn't the point. Sometimes standing in the same space doing the same thing is enough, and adding words to it would only crowd it. Pie came out of the oven an hour before supper, and the smell of it spread through the house the way that particular smell always spreads, unstoppable, specific, the smell of something that has been tended with patience and heat, something that was not edible an hour ago and now is. Cooper appeared in the kitchen doorway before anyone called him for supper. He stood there and looked at the pie cooling on the rack. What kind? He asked. Apple, Dorothea said. He nodded, a single slow nod with the gravity of a small boy who is taking things seriously. Will there be enough? There will be enough, she said. He nodded again and disappeared. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavier than they had been. The first day she arrived, she was almost certain of that, or maybe she was paying different attention now. When Amos came in for supper that evening, he stopped at the doorway the way he sometimes did, the brief pause of a man taking stock before entering a room. He looked at the table. He looked at the pie on the rack. He looked at May, who was already seated and was making a deliberate effort not to appear as pleased with herself as she felt. He sat down. He waited for everyone else to sit, the way he always did, that particular patience, which was one of his better qualities. The quality of a man who understands that his place at the head of the table is given, not taken, and that the giving requires some minimal acknowledgement on his part. Supper passed. The pie was served. Ruth took a piece. She ate it. She said nothing, but she ate the whole piece, and she did not leave the table before the others had finished, the way she sometimes did, when something at the table had displeased her, and Dorothea logged this and moved on. The trouble with Cole came the following week, and it started over firewood. This was the prosaic fact of it, firewood. Specifically, a cord of wood that had been ordered for the kitchen, which needed dry wood, because the range burned hotter and cleaner on dry wood, and Dorothea had noticed that the existing supply was running to damp, which accounted for some of the inconsistencies she'd been having with the oven temperature. She had spoken to Cole about it, because Cole managed the practical ordering for the ranch feed, supplies, maintenance materials, and it seemed the natural chain of communication. Cole had nodded and said he'd look into it. That was 12 days ago. The wood had not come. She had asked again a week later. Cole had said there had been a delay at the supplier. She had said she understood and asked when it was expected. He had said he wasn't certain, that he'd let her know. She went looking for him on a Thursday morning with the specific patience of a woman who has decided that clarity is more useful than confrontation. She found him near the barn with another hand, a younger man named Price who had only been with the ranch a few months. They were talking with the ease of people who are not in a hurry, and Cole looked up when Dorothea appeared, and his expression shifted from relaxed to something more careful. Mrs. Crane, he said. The wood, she said. He had the look of a man who had been hoping this wasn't about what it was about. I haven't had the chance to. It's been nearly 2 weeks, she said. Not angrily, it was a statement of fact, delivered as such. I need a dry supply for the kitchen. Without it, I'm managing the oven by guesswork, and that affects everything I cook. Cole glanced at Price, who was looking at this middle distance, with the intense concentration of a young man trying to be somewhere else without actually moving. Mr. Whitfield has a lot of priorities right now, Cole said. The ranch doesn't run itself. The kitchen isn't always at the top of the list. Dorothea looked at him. I'm not asking you to abandon the ranch, she said. I'm asking for firewood. It's a supply order. It should take 1 day to arrange and 2 to deliver. Maybe so, Cole said. But I answer to Mr. Whitfield, not to he stopped himself. Not to me, Dorothea finished. A pause. I wasn't trying to be rude about it, Cole said. The discomfort in him was visible. He was not a man who enjoyed unpleasantness, which was different from being a man who avoided creating it. Then don't be, Dorothea said simply. Order the wood, Cole. Today she turned and walked back toward the house. She was perhaps 30 feet away when she heard Price say something, low to Cole, and Cole's response, lower still. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She knew the tone. Kept walking. The wood arrived 2 days later. Amos said nothing about it. He either didn't know it had been a problem, or he knew and had chosen not to involve himself. Dorothea was not sure which, and she did not ask. The wood was dry, properly stacked under the lean-to beside the kitchen door, and she adjusted her dampers and her timing, and her oven behaved the way it should, and that was the end of the firewood problem. But Cole avoided the kitchen after that. He had been in the habit before, stopping in for coffee in the late morning, a casual stop, the kind that ranch hands make when they know. The kitchen is a friendly place, and the coffee is good. After the firewood conversation, he stopped doing this. Not obviously, not in a way anyone would have marked if they hadn't been paying attention. But Dorothea noticed, because she paid attention, and she filed it away as information rather than grievance. She was not going to win everyone. That was the reality. In any house, in any situation, there were people who would come to appreciate her, and people who would not, and experience had taught her that spending energy trying to convert the second group was usually wasted. What mattered was whether the people whose opinion actually determined the future of her situation were moving in a useful direction. Amos was the center of that. She understood this clearly, and Amos remained difficult to read. He was fair, in the quiet, practical way of a man who applies fairness because he understands it as a form of ranch management that people work better when they believe they're being dealt with. Honestly, and this is true of family as much as it is of hired hands. He had extended her the month, and he was watching her work through it without interference. But he was not warm with her. He was not unfriend-friendly. He spoke to her at meals, asked her opinions occasionally about practical matters, once held the kitchen door open for her when she came in with her arms full, and said thank you when she set dinner out. These were not nothing. But they were also not the evidence of a man who was reconsidering his original assessment. She thought about this more than she probably should have. She was aware of thinking about it. She was not a woman who confused herself about her own motivations. She had come here looking for a life, not a fantasy. The arrangement had gone sideways from the beginning, and she had stayed anyway, and the reason she had stayed was genuine and complicated, and only partly about the children, who were easier to care about because they were children, and their need was visible and unencumbered by the particular defenses that adults build. She had stayed partly because of Amos, too. She did not think he was a good man in any simple or straightforward sense. He was a man who had done a lot of things well and a few things badly, and had the particular stubbornness of someone who is uncomfortable not being in control of a situation. He had let things in this house go wrong, because fixing them would have required feeling them, and feeling things was not his natural mode of operation. He had paid for a young woman in a photograph, instead of writing an honest letter, and that choice told you something about where he was in his own accounting of things. But he had said, "May I have more?" And he had meant it, and she believed, she was fairly certain she believed, that underneath the calibration and the careful neutrality and the competent management of everything at arm's length, there was a man who was tired of living at arm's length, who had been tired of it for years and didn't know how to cross the distance. She might be wrong. She had been wrong about people before. She was still here, and the month was not yet finished. On the 15th day, something happened that she had not anticipated. Ruth came to the kitchen in the late morning. When Dorothea was alone, Vera was down at the laundry, and May was at her lessons, and Cooper was somewhere outside with the animals, which was becoming a habit of his, a hopeful one. Ruth came in and sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was not unprecedented, and without saying why, which was less usual. Dorothea poured coffee without being asked. Ruth accepted it, which was the interesting thing. Not grudgingly, not with the pointed reluctance of a person making a deliberate concession. She just accepted it and wrapped both hands around the cup in the way people do when they want the warmth more than they want the coffee. Several minutes passed without either of them speaking. She used to make a spice cake, Ruth said finally. Eleanor, on the first Saturday of every month without fail. She stopped, turned the cup in her hands. It was very good. Dorothea sat down across from her with her own cup. Spices, she asked. Ruth looked up. What spices did she use in it? Do you know? Pause, not hostile. More like a woman doing an unexpected kind of arithmetic. Cinnamon, I think. Nutmeg. Something else, I'm not sure. It had a dark flavor. Dense. Cardamom, maybe, Dorothea said. Or cloves. It might have been cloves, Ruth said. She looked at her coffee. I don't know. I was never interested in the cooking. She made a small, imprecise gesture. I was always the one standing in the doorway watching. Dorothea looked at her. Ruth, who was always positioned at the entrance to rooms, near the exit, never fully inside a space, always with an angle on the door. Dorothea had noticed this and had filed it as defensiveness, as strategy. Now she was reconsidering. You were the one standing in the doorway watching, Dorothea said carefully. Because you didn't feel like you belonged in the room? Ruth's hands tightened slightly on the cup. I beg your pardon. I'm not criticizing, Dorothea said. I'm asking. A long silence. Outside, somewhere across the yard, one of the horses made a noise, a brief, carrying sound that dissolved into the ordinary ambient quiet of the ranch. This was Eleanor's house, Ruth said. From the day Amos brought her here, it was hers. Kitchen, the garden, the arrangement of the rooms. She stopped again, and Dorothea waited, because she had learned that Ruth stopped not when she had run out of things to say, but when she was deciding whether to say them. I was his sister. I had a place here, but it wasn't the central place. Eleanor was the center. When she died, Ruth's voice changed register very slightly, a compression that was not quite controlled. When she died, someone needed to hold things together. Amos couldn't do it. Not all of it. Not the house part. So I did, and you've been holding it together since, Dorothea said. Poorly, Ruth said, with the blunt self-assessment of a woman who measures herself honestly, even when the measurement is unfavorable. I'm not, she stopped. The kitchen was never mine. I did what I could. What Vera does is better than what I was doing, which isn't saying much. But she didn't gesture at anything specific, but the gesture didn't need to be specific what you do. Different. Dorothea was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to say the next thing. You've been the center, she said, since Eleanor. You stepped into the space because nobody else did, and you've been holding it for 4 years. Ruth looked at her sharply, checking for condescension. She didn't find it. And then I arrived, Dorothea said, and walked into your kitchen and started making myself useful. And I thought you were positioning yourself, Ruth said. Still think that. Maybe I am, Dorothea said. Positioning myself for what? I'm 38 years old, Ruth. I came here on an arrangement that went wrong before I walked through the door. I don't have any illusions about what I am and what I'm not. She turned the coffee cup in her own hands. I'm not trying to be Eleanor. I'm not trying to displace you from whatever you've built here in the last 4 years. I'm trying, she paused, looking for the most accurate word, to add something. Not replace. Ruth sat with this. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the branches knocked against each other with the dry wood percussion of late summer. Cooper is eating, Ruth said finally. Yes, Dorothea said. Ruth stopped. Started again. It frightened me. How little he ate. He was getting thin. The doctor wasn't helpful. She pressed her mouth together briefly, worried, in the way he gets worried, which means he doesn't say anything to anyone and just gets tighter. I noticed, Dorothea said. Ruth looked at her. What do you do to get him to eat? I make food that tastes like it was made for him, Dorothea said. And I don't make a performance of watching him eat it. I let him come to it without an audience. Ruth turned her cup. That sounds simple. Most of it is simple, Dorothea said. The consistent doing of it, that's hard. Another long silence. Not an uncomfortable one, which was, Dorothea noted, a development. I said things about you, Ruth said. To Amos last week. I know, Dorothea said. Ruth looked up. You heard. Kitchen window was open, Dorothea said. I was in the garden. Beat. Ruth's expression shifted through something complicated and came out the other side at a kind of resigned acknowledgement. I said you were positioning yourself. You did, Dorothea said. I said you had nothing, and this ranch was the best you'd see. You did. Ruth was quiet for a moment, with the particular stillness of a person who has been confronted with themselves and isn't entirely comfortable. You didn't come in and say anything about it. What would I have said? Dorothea asked. You weren't wrong about the facts. I don't have much. This ranch is, she paused. This is a good life. I'd like to be part of it. Those things are both true. But, Ruth said, because something in Dorothea's tone invited it. But I was also standing in your garden turning your soil, Dorothea said, and I thought that was worth more than an argument. Ruth looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Dorothea had the odd, specific sensation of being genuinely seen by this woman, rather than categorized. You are extremely difficult to dislike, Ruth said finally. She did not sound pleased about it. People tell me that, Dorothea said, and something's not quite a smile, but the leading edge of one crossed Ruth's face before she could catch it and pull it back. The month ended on a Friday. Dorothea was aware of this, the way you are aware of a weather change, before the weather changes in the quality of the day, in the particular attention she brought to the morning's work, in the way she moved through the kitchen with a small extra deliberateness. She had done what she could in a month. She knew what she had done and where it was insufficient. Cooper was eating and had begun to lose some of the gray paper quality his skin had carried when she arrived. May had learned to make pastry dough and had begun asking questions about everything else, the questions of a girl who has discovered that a body of knowledge exists and wants to know its edges. Ruth had sat at the kitchen table and talked to her once, in a way that had cost Ruth something and had given Dorothea something in return. Vera moved through the kitchen with less anxiety. The garden was partially turned, not planted too late in the season, and she hadn't wanted to push it. The beds were broken and aerated and ready for spring, if spring was something she would be here for. She did not know if she would be here for spring. She was thinking about this, or more accurately, she was doing the kitchen work and letting the thought run underneath it at a low, steady volume when Amos appeared in the doorway at 9:30 in the morning, which was not his usual time to be inside. He stood there for a moment, in the way that she now recognized the brief stock-taking pause, the man deciding how to enter a room. The month is up, he said. I know, she said. She was sorting dried beans at the table, the meditative work of running your fingers through them, pulling out the withered ones, the stones, the cracked. She kept doing it while she talked. I'd like you to stay, Amos said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, the same posture he'd had the first day she arrived, which might have been coincidence or might have been something else. His expression was not the calibrated neutral of the first day. It was something more open and considerably less comfortable, the expression of a man saying something he had decided to say before he changed his mind. Not on a month's trial, he said, permanently, or as close to permanent as these things get. Dorothea looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the beans. We should talk about what that means, she said. What it looks like. What the arrangement actually is. Yes, he said. We should. Not today, she said. I need to think. And you need to mean it when we talk about it, not just have said it. A pause. That's fair, he said. She nodded and went back to the beans. And he stood in the doorway for another moment before he left. And the kitchen was quiet again. Just the sound of dried beans and the range and the wind outside. And Dorothea sat with all of it and let herself, carefully and without drama, feel the first small unclenching of something she had been holding tight for a very long time. She still had work to do. More work than a month's demonstration had shown. More problems in this house than food and a turned garden could address. And she knew it. She knew about the buried grief and the things that had not been said and the ways this family had learned to live at a distance from each other that passed for normalcy. She also knew, with the particular knowledge of a woman who has rebuilt things before, that knowing what needs to be done is the harder part. The doing, once you know, is just time and attention. She had both. She sorted the last of the beans and stood up and started on supper. The conversation at the kitchen doorway lasted less than 3 minutes, and Amos did not bring it up again that day, or the next. This was consistent with everything Dorothea had come to understand about him. He said a thing when he had decided to say it, and then he stepped back and let it sit, the way you let a post set in new ground before you hang weight on it, testing whether it would hold before he committed to it fully. She did not push. She had meant what she said. He needed to mean it when they talked about it properly, not just have said it in a doorway on a Friday morning with his hat in his hands and something unfamiliar moving across his face. She went on cooking. She went on turning the garden beds in the late afternoon. She went on teaching May, in the unofficial, undeclared way that was working, precisely because it was unofficial and undeclared. No lessons, no schedule, just two people in the same kitchen doing the same work, one of whom knew more than the other and was willing to say so when asked. Cooper had started coming to the kitchen in the mornings. Not every morning. He was not a child who did things on a schedule. He operated by some internal logic that had its own timing and was not responsive to external structure. Dorothea suspected was one of the reasons he had struggled so badly in the period after his mother died, when the house had tried to manage its grief by becoming more rigid. He came when he came, usually around mid-morning, and he would appear in the doorway and stand there until she noticed him. She always noticed him. Immediately, but she had learned to wait a beat before looking up, because the beat gave him time to decide he had arrived on his own terms rather than being received. "What are you making?" he asked. On the Monday after Amos had stood in the kitchen doorway and said he wanted her to stay. "Stock," she said, "the bones from Sunday's roast." Came in and sat at the corner of the table that had become, by some unspoken agreement, his corner. He watched her work with the particular focused attention he gave to things he was trying to understand, not restless, not performing interest, just genuinely looking. "Why do you save the bones?" he asked. "Because the bones have things in them that the meat doesn't," she said. "Minerals, collagen, all the things that were holding the animal together. When you cook them long enough, they come out into the liquid." Cooper considered this. "So the stock is made of the parts most people throw away." "Mostly, yes." He thought about that. "That seems right," he said, with the gravity of a small boy who has decided something confirms a theory he's been developing. Dorothea glanced at him. "Why does it seem right?" "Because the parts people throw away are usually the most useful," he said. Then, as though he'd said more than he intended to, he looked back at the table and added nothing. She didn't push it. She went back to the stock. He stayed for an hour, not talking much, and then went back outside. When she called him for lunch, he ate everything on his plate. Trouble she hadn't anticipated came from a direction she hadn't been watching. She had been watching Cole, who was still keeping his distance. She had been watching Ruth, who had not sat at the kitchen table again, but who had stopped manufacturing reasons to contradict Dorothea in front of the children. She had been watching the subtle daily mathematics of the household, trying to track where the resistance was and whether it was moving. She had not been watching the town. Kessler Flats was not a large settlement, but it was large enough to have the particular social architecture of any place where people know each other's business without being asked, a geography of alliances and histories and small resentments that operated just below the surface of ordinary transactions. Dorothy had been to town 3 times since arriving, once with Cole for provisions, twice on her own, and each time she had noticed the way people looked at her, calibration happening in real time as they connected the strange woman staying at the Whitfield Ranch with whatever version of the story had reached them. The story that had reached them, she discovered on the 3rd visit, was not entirely accurate. She found this out in the dry goods store from a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who had the bright, careful eyes of a person who collects information the way others collect porcelain, and who engaged Dorothea in conversation with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times before. "You're staying on at Whitfield's, then?" Mrs. Alcott said. "Not quite a question." "I am," Dorothea said. "Longer than expected, Mrs. Alcott said, given that she paused delicately. "Circumstances of the original arrangement." Dorothea looked at the shelf in front of her. "Circumstances change." "They do," Mrs. Alcott agreed, in a tone that suggested she had a great deal of information about how and why they had changed in this particular case. "It was the Halverson woman, who was originally supposed to go to Amos, you know. Clara Halverson, from up near the Millhaven territory. 23, pretty girl, father's a merchant." She adjusted a jar on the counter with the small, precise movements of a woman tidying something that doesn't need tidying. She withdrew from the arrangement when she received an offer from someone more local. Dorothea turned to look at her. "Is that so?" And the solicitor, apparently, scrambled to fill the arrangement without adequate communication. Mrs. Alcott met her eyes with the direct look of a woman who wants it understood that she is sharing information and not manufacturing it. "You were not, in other words, Amos Whitfield's first choice." "I imagine you know that." "I do know that," Dorothea said. "What you may not know," Mrs. Alcott said, "is that there are people in this town who find the current situation." She paused again. The pause of a woman with a thesaurus running in the background, irregular. A woman of unknown background, staying on at a widower's ranch past the terms of the original arrangement. People talk. People always talk, Dorothea said. They do, Mrs. Alcott said. And some of what they say reaches Amos Whitfield. He is a man whose reputation matters to him. She picked up her parcel from the counter and looked at Dorothea for a moment, with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite warning, and was probably some combination of both. I'm not telling you this to discourage you, she said. I'm telling you because I think you should know the full landscape. She left. Dorothea stood in the dry goods store and looked at the shelf of supplies she had come for and did not immediately move. The full landscape. She had not thought enough about reputation. Her own she had considered the fact of being a 38-year-old widow in irregular circumstances at a wealthy man's ranch was obvious enough that she would have had to work to avoid thinking about it. But she had been thinking about it only as it affected her, her position, her standing in the household. She had not thought carefully enough about what it did to Amos Whitfield, who ran the largest ranch in the territory, who had a reputation built over decades of dealing fair and working hard and conducting himself according to a particular standard, who had a son and a daughter and a community that watched him, and who had, perhaps, more to lose from irregular circumstances than Dorothea did. She bought her supplies and walked back to the wagon and drove back to the ranch, and she thought about the full landscape the entire way. She did not say anything to Amos that day. She needed to think through what she would say and how she would say it, and she had learned over the years that the thinking through was not something she could rush. She gave it 2 days, and on the second evening after supper, when the children had gone up and Ruth had retired and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she knocked on the open door of his office. He was at the desk. He looked up with the expression of a man who has been working through numbers for long enough that looking at a person is briefly a relief. Mrs. Crane, he said. She came in and sat in the guest chair and folded her hands in her lap. I need to tell you something, she said, and I want you to hear it without deciding immediately how to respond. Can you do that? He leaned back in his chair. I can try. She told him what Mrs. Alcott had said. Not embellished, not editorialized the facts as she understood them, the situation as it stood. That she was aware of the irregularity of her position. Town was talking, that whatever the town was saying was reaching him, and that she had not been thinking carefully enough about what that cost him. Amos listened. He did the thing he did when he was processing something important, which was very still, the stillness of a man whose activity has relocated entirely inside. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Alcott told you this, he said. Yes, she's not wrong, he said. About the talking. He turned a pen in his fingers, an idle automatic motion. I've heard some of it. What do they say? Dorothea asked. He looked at her with an expression that assessed whether the question was genuine, decided it was. They say I've been taken advantage of by a woman with limited options who saw an opportunity and positioned herself to be difficult to remove. He said it flatly, the way you quote something you're not endorsing. Some are less polite about it. Dorothea absorbed this. And what do you think? I think, Amos said slowly, that most of the people saying it have not watched Cooper eat a complete meal in 4 years and seen him eat 2 servings in a single sitting. He set the pen down. I think what other people think about my household is a consideration, not a determination. Your reputation matters, Dorothea said. I'm not dismissing that. My reputation, he said, has survived more than irregular domestic arrangements. He looked at her directly. What I want to know is what you want me to do with what you've just told me. You didn't come in here to report information. You came in here to have a conversation. What's the conversation? She had expected to need more preamble than this. He had moved through it faster than she'd anticipated. I want to know if you still mean what you said Friday, she said. Now that I've said all of that. Whether knowing the full picture changes your answer. A long pause. Outside the wind had come up and was moving through the cottonwoods, the branches making their dry percussion sound. My answer was that I want you to stay, Amos said. That has not changed. He said it with the particular deliberate quality of a man who has thought about something until it is settled and is now reporting the settled thing rather than performing the consideration. What changes is how we handle it. We're not. I don't want the situation to be ambiguous. For you or for anyone else. Dorothea looked at him. You're talking about formalizing the arrangement, she said. I'm talking about a proper proposal, he said, when you're ready for it. I understand. That's a different thing than asking you to stay. He sat with that for a moment. Amos, she said, And it was the first time she had used his given name, which she noted and which he noted. She could tell from the fractional shift in his expression. I need you to understand that I'm not in a hurry. I don't want you to propose because the town is talking. I want you to propose when you actually want to. I know the difference, he said. Do you? She said it without heat. Because you were very good at managing this situation for a month. Watching, assessing. It's possible that what you want is for the management of the situation to become more permanent. That's a different thing from wanting me. He was quiet. You're right, he said finally. There's a difference. And he stopped, with the particular halting quality of a man who is not used to this type of sentence. I've been doing a lot of managing, with everything, for a long time. I know, she said. I'm not certain I know what the other thing is, he said. Wanting something, rather than deciding something is reasonable. It was the most honest thing he had said to her. She felt it as such the specific quality of unexpected honesty, which is always slightly disorienting because you're not positioned for it. Then don't propose yet, she said. Stay and figure that out. I'm not going anywhere. You said that before, he said. On the second day. I meant it then too, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she still couldn't entirely classify. Then he picked up the pen again, and she understood the conversation was finished, and she said good night and left. What followed was a different kind of month from the first. The first month had been about proving something. She had known it was a trial, conducted under the particular scrutiny of people who expected her to fail, and she had worked with the awareness of that scrutiny always present somewhere behind her. The second month was something different. The question of whether she was staying had been answered. The question of what staying meant was still open, and it was a more interesting question, and it required a different kind of attention. Ruth changed the most visibly. It happened gradually in the way that significant changes often do not an event, but an accumulation. Ruth began appearing in the kitchen not as an inspector, but as a person who had somewhere decided the kitchen was a space she was permitted to occupy. She did not cook, she showed no inclination toward it, and Dorothea did not push, but she sat at the table with her coffee. And she talked, and what she said when she talked was different from the sharp, positioned things she had said in the first weeks. She told Dorothea about the ranch, not the operations Amos handled those, and they were his territory, but the history of the place. The things that had happened here across the years that had made it what it was. She talked about the early years when Amos and Eleanor had first built the house, how Eleanor had planted the garden in the first summer with seeds she'd brought from her family's farm 3 counties away, and how half of them had died, and she'd replanted from local stock the following spring without making a tragedy of the loss. She talked about Cooper's birth and the difficult winter that followed it. She talked about the year the east pasture flooded, and they'd lost enough cattle to make the difference between a good year and a very bad one, and how Amos had handled it without showing the household the extent of the damage. What she was doing, Dorothea understood, was handing something over, the knowledge of this place, giving Dorothea the context that would make her more capable here, and doing it in the form of conversation rather than instruction, because Ruth was a proud woman, and instruction would have required her to be in the explicit position of helping, which she wasn't ready for. Dorothy received it in the same spirit. She listened, asked questions that opened things up, rather than closed them down, and said nothing about the fact that the shape of what was happening was Ruth teaching her. Coal remained the problem. She had thought it would resolve on its own, the way small frictions often do once the initial cause has been addressed. The wood had arrived. He had no legitimate grievance, but Cole had made, in the weeks after the wood conversation, a series of small choices that were each individually deniable and collectively unmistakable. The way he failed to pass her information about supply deliveries until after they'd already arrived. The way he spoke to Vera with extra warmth when Dorothea was in earshot, as though demonstrating that his friendliness to the kitchen extended only so far. The way he talked to Amos about ranch business at the entrance to the main room when Dorothea was working inside, close enough that it was not accidental. She had let it go longer than she probably should have. She was not someone who liked conflict. She was someone who could do it when it was necessary, but she did not find it natural, and she had hoped the problem would diminish on its own terms. It did not. The thing that finally made it impossible to leave alone was Cooper. She was not there when it happened. She heard about it from May, who had been near enough to see it, and had come to Dorothea afterward with the specific agitation of a child who has witnessed something unjust and needs an adult to help her understand it. Cooper had been in the barn, working with one of the younger horses, a 2-year-old that had been giving everyone trouble because it was skittish and didn't handle strangers. Cooper had developed a quiet approach to the animal over several weeks, spending time near it without pressure, the kind of patient work that is temperamentally unusual in a child his age. Cooper was temperamentally unusual in several ways that Dorothea had come to see as assets rather than deficits. Cole had come into the barn and seen Cooper with the horse and made a comment. May didn't remember the exact words, something about whether it was a good idea for the boy to be in there, alone, with an animal that had already thrown one of the hands. Ordinary concern, plausible deniability. But the way he'd said it in front of Price and another hand who was new had made Cooper pull back from the horse and leave the barn with the expression of a boy who had been publicly subtracted from something. Cooper didn't say anything, May told her. He just left. But he looked. She stopped, trying to find the word. Small, Dorothea said. Yes, May said. He looked small. Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." And May left, and Dorothea stood in the kitchen and considered what she was going to do. She had two options. She could speak to Cole again, directly, which she had done once before, and which had produced the current situation. Or she could speak to Amos. She did not want to speak to Amos. It felt she examined the feeling honestly, like going over Cole's head, which had a particular character that she was uncomfortable with, an appeal to authority that she preferred not to make, partly because she liked doing things herself, and partly because making it would demonstrate a kind of vulnerability, a concession that she couldn't handle the situation without help. Cooper had walked out of the barn looking small, and that was not Cole's call to make. She spoke to Amos that evening, before supper, in the brief window when the kitchen was under control, and the children hadn't come down yet. She told him what May had told her. She kept it short. Amos listened. His expression during the listening was the careful neutral she knew, but underneath it something had moved. She had gotten better, over the weeks, at reading the undercurrents. "I'll speak to Cole," he said. "I'm not asking you to make it a large thing," she said. "I just need you to know it's happening." "It's a large thing," he said. "When it comes to Cooper." He looked at her. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded and went back to the kitchen. The conversation Amos had with Cole she was not present for and did not ask about afterward. But Cole's behavior changed within 3 days, not dramatically, not with any performance of amendment, but the small consistent friction stopped. He began passing information about deliveries again. He stopped positioning himself in doorways. The particular quality of his silence around Dorothea shifted from pointed to merely neutral. She accepted this without making a production of it. Cooper went back to the barn with the 2-year-old. She knew this because May told her, and because a few days later, Cooper came into the kitchen in the late morning and sat at his corner of the table with a specific quality about him, something settled, something that had been unsettled and had found its way back. "The horse let me touch his face today," Cooper said. "The full palm he used to pull away." "That takes a long time," Dorothea said. "Horses like that." "I know," Cooper said. "I didn't rush it." He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. "You said once that you don't rush things that need to happen in their own time." She had said this in the context of bread dough, which Cooper had watched her make, and had asked why she didn't do anything to make it rise faster. "I did say that," she said. "It works with horses too," he said. "Not as a revelation, as a confirmation, a thing verified." Put a plate in front of him. He ate. The evening the first outsider came to the ranch on account of her cooking was an ordinary Thursday in October. Cooler than it had been, but not yet properly cold, kind of day where the light goes golden early and stays that way for a while before dropping. The woman's name was Nora Fielding. She was a rancher's wife from some miles out, and she arrived at the front door with a manner that suggested she had decided to do this and was not entirely certain she'd made the right decision. She asked for Mrs. Crane, showed her through to the kitchen, which Dorothea thought was interesting. Could have said Dorothea was busy. He could have conducted the visit himself. Instead, he brought Nora Fielding to the kitchen and said, "Mrs. Crane, Mrs. Fielding is looking for some advice," and left. Nora Fielding stood in the kitchen and looked at Dorothea with the combination of need and embarrassment that characterizes a person who has gone somewhere for help, but is uncomfortable being the person who needed to ask. "Mrs. Alcott told me about you," Nora said. "She said that the Whitfield kitchen was—" She stopped and tried again. "My husband is having trouble eating. He was sick in September, and he never came back to himself properly, and now he'll eat a little broth and not much else." She pressed her lips together. "The doctor says there's nothing more wrong with him, that it's just that it'll pass. But it's been 6 weeks." Dorothea looked at her. She thought about Cooper, who had arrived at the ranch eating almost nothing, and what she had done and had not done to change it. She thought about the cards in the tin box, and specifically the card in her grandmother's handwriting that said, on the back, in smaller letters than the recipe, "The body knows what it needs, but sometimes it forgets. Your job is to remind it." "Sit down," Dorothea said. "Tell me what he used to like, before he got sick." Nora sat, she talked. Dorothea listened and asked questions, and after half an hour she had a reasonable picture of a man who had lost his appetite, not because there was something wrong with him, but because 6 weeks of illness had disconnected him from the ordinary pleasures of eating, and the food being offered to him since recovery had been well-intentioned and characterless. She sent Nora Fielding home, with written instructions for 3 things: a bone broth prepared in a particular way, a specific preparation of soft-cooked apples with butter and a very small amount of salt, and a plain but properly seasoned porridge made from coarse grain, rather than the fine-ground type that had no texture to it. "Don't watch him eat," Dorothea said, as Nora was leaving. "Whatever you do, put the food in front of him and leave the room." Nora looked uncertain. "And that will help?" "Being watched makes everything harder," Dorothea said. "Even eating." Nora left. Dorothea stood in the kitchen door, watching the wagon go, and thought about the look on Nora's face, the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a worry alone for long enough that even uncertain hope feels like relief. Ruth appeared beside her. Dorothea hadn't heard her come in. "That's the second one," Ruth said. Dorothea looked at her. The second person from outside, who has come here specifically to talk to you," Ruth said. She was not being accusatory. Her tone was more observational than anything, the tone of a woman noticing a pattern and naming it. "A woman came to the front door last week. She asked Cole if the woman cooking at the Whitfield Ranch might have a few minutes. Told her you were busy." Dorothea turned to look at her. "He didn't tell me." "No," Ruth said, "he didn't." They looked at each other. "Do you know who it was?" Dorothea asked. "Young woman," Ruth said. "I didn't recognize her. New to the area, I think." Ruth paused. She looked the way people look when they've come a distance, and they're not sure it was the right decision. Dorothea looked back at the track Nora Fielding's wagon had taken, already out of sight behind the tree line. She thought about what Mrs. Alcott had said, the full landscape. She was beginning to understand that the full landscape was larger than she had initially mapped it. "Did you tell Amos?" she asked. "No," Ruth said. "I'm telling you." Dorothea nodded slowly. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at it, the range, the shelves with their organized supplies, the window with the herb pot she'd started 3 weeks ago growing steadily on the sill, table where Cooper sat in the mornings, and May stood on the other side, learning to feel the difference between overworked dough and right dough. She had thought of this as a kitchen, a single kitchen, belonging to a single household, doing the ordinary necessary work of feeding the people inside it. She was beginning to think it might be more than that, and that the more that had implications she needed to think through before she understood them fully. Outside, the October light held its gold for a while longer, and the cottonwoods moved in the wind, and the ranch settled around her, like something that had decided, without consulting either of them, that she belonged in it. The young woman Cole had turned away, came back on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Nora Fielding's visit. Dorothea was in the kitchen garden when she heard the wagon, not one of the ranches, from the sound of the horse, a lighter animal, with a quicker step, and she straightened up from the bed she'd been working, and saw a woman, perhaps 25 years old, climbing down from a small buckboard with the careful deliberateness of someone whose pregnancy is far enough along to make every physical negotiation conscious. She was alone. She had driven herself. Dorothea set down the hand fork and walked toward her. The young woman saw her coming and stopped moving as though she'd been caught doing something uncertain and hadn't decided yet whether to continue. She had a plain, tired face, not the tiredness of a single difficult night, but the accumulated tiredness of months, the kind that gets into the skin. "Are you Mrs. Crane?" she asked. "I am," Dorothea said. "My name is Hattie Greer," the woman said. "My husband farms out on the Tilden Road. I came a few weeks ago, but," she stopped. "I was told you were busy." "I wasn't busy," Dorothea said. "Come inside." She brought Hattie Greer into the kitchen and put water on without asking, because the woman had driven herself some miles in her condition, and water was the first thing regardless of whatever else was needed. Hattie sat at the table and held her hands in her lap and looked around the kitchen the way people look at a space they've been told about, checking the reality of it against the description they'd received. "What did Nora Fielding tell you?" Dorothea asked. Hattie looked at her. That you helped her husband start eating again. A pause. And that you didn't make her feel stupid for asking. Dorothea poured water and set it in front of her. What's going on with you? What came out then was not one problem, but several tangled together in the way that problems accumulate in a life that doesn't have adequate margin. Hattie's husband was a good man, but a worried one, and the farm had had a poor yield the last 2 seasons, and the pregnancy was her 3rd in 4 years, and the first 2 had not been easy, and she was not sleeping, and she was not eating enough, and the things she could manage to eat were so limited and so monotonous that the act of eating had become something she endured rather than something that helped her. Dorothea listened to all of it. She did not rush past the personal parts to get to the practical ones, because the personal parts were the context that made the practical parts make sense. When Hattie finished, she looked slightly surprised at herself, the look of a person who said more than they planned to. I didn't come to complain, she said. You came to ask for help, Dorothea said. That's different. She spent 40 minutes with Hattie Greer. She talked about what the body needs during late pregnancy that it will often refuse to ask for directly, and how to read the refusals, the specific aversions that signal a deficiency rather than just a preference, the things that look like lost appetite but are actually the body redirecting its resources. She wrote down preparations, simple ones that didn't require elaborate supplies or long cooking times, and she gave Hattie a small paper parcel of the dried herbs she'd been growing on the kitchen windowsill. When Hattie left, she looked different than when she'd arrived. Not fixed, Dorothea was not confused about what she could and could not accomplish in 40 minutes. But something in the tiredness had shifted. The specific exhaustion of feeling alone with a problem had reduced by some measurable degree. Dorothea stood in the kitchen door watching the buckboard go, and she was still standing there when Ruth's voice came from behind her. You didn't charge her anything, Ruth said. Dorothea turned. Ruth was at the table with her coffee, which meant she'd been there for at least part of the conversation. She did not appear to have any particular feeling about this. She stated it as observation, not as criticism. No, Dorothea said. She could have paid something. Could have, Dorothea agreed. She farms on the Tilden Road with 2 small children, and a 3rd on the way after 2 poor yields. She's already driven here herself because they likely can't afford to pay someone else to drive her. Ruth turned her cup. Nora Fielding could pay. Nora Fielding didn't come with money in hand either, Dorothea said. And I didn't ask for any. A silence. You're building something, Ruth said. It had the quality of a thing said aloud after being thought for a while. Not an accusation, not a warning. Just a naming. You may not know what it is yet, but you're building something. Dorothea sat down across from her. What do you think I'm building? Ruth considered this with the serious attention she gave to most things when she had decided to engage with them genuinely. A reason to be here that doesn't depend on Amos, she said finally. Place in this community that's yours. Not the cook at the Whitfield Ranch. Not the woman in the arrangement that went wrong. Something with its own standing. Dorothea looked at her. It was, she thought, the most accurate thing Ruth had said about her since she'd arrived. More accurate than Ruth probably knew, because Dorothea had not quite articulated it to herself in those terms, and hearing it from outside herself made it suddenly clear in a way that internal thought hadn't achieved. Yes, she said, I think that's right. Ruth nodded slowly. She did not say anything more about it. She finished her coffee and stood and left the kitchen, and Dorothea sat with the observation and turned it over and looked at it from several angles. She told Amos about Hattie Greer that evening. Not the details, those were Hattie's, but the fact of the visit, and about the woman Cole had turned away 3 weeks earlier. Amos listened. His expression during the listening was not the neutral she'd become accustomed to reading it, was something more active, more engaged, tracking what she was saying with the focused attention he applied to things that mattered to him. Cole should have told you, he said when she was done. He should have, she said. But that's a small thing. What I want to talk about is the larger one. She folded her hands on the table between them. People are coming here for help, Amos. A few people. And I think more will come. And I need to know whether that's something you're willing to have happen here, because it affects this household, and this is your household. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of help? Food-related, she said. Illness recovery. Poor appetite. Pregnancy. The kind of things that fall between what a doctor addresses and what a neighbor can do. There's a gap in this community, and I happen to know how to fill it, and people have figured that out. She paused. I want to do it, but not without your knowledge, and not in a way that turns your kitchen into a public space without your agreement. Amos looked at her steadily, and if I said I wasn't willing, She met his eyes. Then I would respect that, and I'd find another way to do it. Another way meaning what exactly? Meaning I could give advice by correspondence, or make visits rather than receiving them. Or she paused. Or attached myself differently. Somewhere with a proper kitchen and the ability to receive people without it involving your home. He was quiet again. Outside the window, the night had come on fully, and the wind was up, and they could both hear it moving through the structure of the house, in the way old houses always register wind, a creak here, a draft there, particular voice of a building that has been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather. You're describing leaving, he said. I'm describing one of my options if you'd prefer I not bring outside people to your kitchen, she said. I am not threatening you with it. It sounds like threatening. She said. I'm not. I'm trying to be honest about the full picture, which is something you've told me you appreciate. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, let them come. This kitchen is large enough, and what you're doing for those women matters. He said the last part with a slight roughness, as though it had come out ahead of his full intention, and he didn't walk it back. I should have been told about Cole turning someone away. Yes, she said. I'll speak to him again. I know you will, she said. Stood up to leave. He said Dorothea. It was the first time he had used her given name. Stopped. The proposal, he said. He did not say it easily. There was something working in his face, the particular labor of a man who has spent a long time not saying certain kinds of things and is finding the mechanism stiff from disuse. I told you I'd wait until I was certain. I think I'm close to certain. She looked at him. Close to certain isn't there yet, she said. No, he agreed, it's not. When you're there, she said, you'll know. And so will I. Good night, Amos. Good night, he said. And she left, and the house was quiet around her. November arrived with the first hard frost and a specific change in the quality of the household that Dorothea noticed the way you notice a change in season gradually. Then all at once, and with the retrospective sense that the signs had been present for longer than you'd consciously registered. Cooper had grown visibly since September. Not dramatically, children don't grow dramatically. They grow in the small incremental ways that adults around them miss, because they're looking too closely. And then suddenly one day the child is a different size than they remembered. He had gone from slight and gray complexioned to something approaching ordinary boyhood robustness. He ate well at every meal. He spent his mornings in the barn with the 2-year-old horse, which he had named without asking anyone's permission, and which now followed him around the barn with the specific devotion of an animal that has decided it has a person. He had also started talking more. Not to everyone, Cooper was constitutionally a selective talker, and nothing about the last few months had changed his fundamental nature. But he talked to Dorothea with a consistency and a range that she found genuinely surprising for a child who had been almost entirely silent when she arrived. He asked her questions about things she knew about cooking, about plants, about why certain things worked certain ways, and also about things neither of them knew. Kind of speculative questions that suggest a mind running ahead of its available information and looking for a companion in the running. Do you think animals remember things the way people do? He asked her one morning in November, sitting at his corner with a cup of warm cider she'd taken to making for him as the weather went cold. I think they remember differently, she said, more with their bodies than with stories. They remember how something felt more than the event itself. The horse remembers that I was patient with him, Cooper said. Not that I did specific things, just that I was safe. That's exactly right, she said. He nodded with that gravity of his. Then do you think that's how people work too, sometimes? Thought about this. I think the people who had early lives where they didn't feel safe often remember it that way. In the body, not just in the mind. And it takes a long time to teach the body something different. Cooper looked at his cider. Is that why I didn't eat? She was careful with this. She did not want to give him a story about himself that he might wear wrong later. I don't know, she said honestly. You'd know better than I would. But I think sometimes when everything else feels uncertain, the body decides what it can and can't manage. And eating requires a kind of openness, a willingness to take something in. And if you're not feeling safe enough to be open, it's hard. He sat with this for a while. I felt safer after you came, he said. Not as a compliment, as a reported fact, the way he reported most things, with the careful empiricism of a boy who does not exaggerate. She did not know what to do with that, except accept it, which she did, without making a ceremony of it. Good, she said, and went back to the range. May's progress in the kitchen had reached the point where she could be trusted with things she had not been specifically shown. The way a student reaches the point where they understand the principle rather than just the procedure. She made a soup one afternoon in early November entirely on her own, while Dorothea was dealing with a ewe that had gotten into the kitchen garden and required removal, a long, absurd, physical negotiation that left Dorothea muddy and slightly exasperated. Came back into the kitchen to find May at the range, and the kitchen smelling promisingly of onion and celery and something roasted. "What did you do?" Dorothea asked, looking at the pot. "I looked at what we had," May said. She had the straight-backed posture of someone expecting judgment and committed to not appearing anxious about it. There were the last of the celery roots and some leeks and the heel of the smoked ham. I roasted the celery root first because I thought it would need the most time, and then I added the leeks, and then I made a stock from the ham bone. She paused. I charred the onion. Dorothea looked at her. "I know it looks wrong," May said, "but you said the dark parts have the most flavor." "I said the strongest things are made through fire," Dorothea said, "but the principle is the same." She picked up a spoon and tasted the soup. She did not rush the tasting, she let it sit for a moment, sorting through what she was getting. It was good. Not perfect, the seasoning needed another pass, and she could taste that May had used a little too much of the dried thyme, which was an easy mistake when you're working without a recipe and trying to compensate for uncertainty with seasoning. But the bones of it were correct. The stock was deep, and the sweetness of the roasted celery came through without overwhelming, and the char on the onion was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. "Salt," Dorothea said, "and go light on it, taste after every addition. Slightly overused the thyme, which is fine, but it means you need to be careful not to drive the flavor any harder in another direction." May tasted, added a small measure of salt, tasted again, nodded. "Did I make a mistake with the thyme?" she asked. "You made a choice," Dorothea said. "Choices aren't mistakes unless you can't learn from them. What would you do differently next time?" May thought about it. "Use less thyme earlier. You can always add more, but you can't take it out." "Correct," Dorothea said. "You can't uncook anything. That's the fundamental difficulty of cooking, and also the fundamental lesson of it." May served the soup at supper that night and said nothing about having made it. Dorothea also said nothing about it. The family ate. Cooper had 2 bowls. Ruth looked at the pot with the expression of a woman doing quiet accounting. At the end of the meal, Amos said, "This is good." May looked at the table. "May made it," Dorothea said. The look on Amos Whitfield's face when he turned to his daughter was not something Dorothea looked at for long, because it was private, the specific unguarded expression of a man seeing his child in a new way, and she gave it the privacy it deserved. But she saw it and she held it somewhere. May said, "I used the charred onion method." "Did you?" Amos said. "Mrs. Crane taught me," May said. "But I figured out the rest from what we had." Amos looked at his daughter for a moment more. Then he said, "Next time, can you make more? This pot is almost gone." And May, who was 12 years old and had spent the better part of 4 years forgetting what it felt like to be the center of something good, smiled so wide it looked for a moment like it might inconvenience her face. The formal proposal came on a Sunday in late November, 11 weeks after the kitchen doorway conversation. She had expected it to happen in the office. Amos was a man who conducted serious business in the office, the desk, the maps, the ledgers, the contained space of things handled properly. She had built a small, definite expectation of sitting in the guest chair that had seen more use in the last 2 months than in the years before it, and hearing him say what he had decided to say. Instead, he came to the kitchen garden. She had been out there in the thin November sun, cutting back the last of the season's growth, and laying a mulch of straw over the beds to protect the soil through winter. It was the kind of work she did without needing to think about it, and she had been letting her mind go where it wanted while her hands did the familiar motions. And it had gone to several places she'd expected, and a few she hadn't. She heard his boots on the path before she saw him, kept working for a moment, then straightened and turned. He was standing at the garden's edge in his good coat, not his working one. She noticed this. The good coat on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen garden was an intention made visible. He looked at the beds she'd been working on. He looked at the straw mulch laid carefully across the exposed soil. He looked at her, standing in the middle of it with garden dirt on her hands and a piece of straw in her hair that she was not aware of. "You're putting it to bed for winter," he said. "So it's ready for spring," she said. He stepped into the garden, which he had never done before. He had stood at its edge several times, watching her work from the boundary, but he had never come inside the beds themselves. He walked to where she was standing, and she saw clearly, now that he was close, that he was managing nerves, which was something she had not seen in him before. Amos Whitfield did not show nerves. He showed control and patience and the deliberate stillness of a man who does not let the external register of his state get ahead of him. He could see it. The way he held himself was slightly more careful than usual, the posture of someone balancing something. He did not make a speech. She had not expected a speech from him, and she would not have trusted one if he'd made it. Speeches are prepared, and prepared things have a way of saying less than they appear to. I meant what I said, he said. The month. And after the month. I want you to stay. Not as he stopped, recalibrated. I want you as my wife, if you're willing. She looked at him. She thought about the first day, when he had stood with his hat in his hands and said nothing, while Ruth held up the wrong photograph. Thought about the bowl of broth and the 3 quiet words. She thought about the month and the second month, and the kitchen full of Cooper's steady presence, and May's charred onion soup, and Ruth's coffee cup held in both hands. She thought about Hattie Greer climbing carefully down from a buckboard, alone, and Nora Fielding's face shifting from worry toward something that was not quite relief, but was its direction. She thought about what Ruth had said, a reason to be here that doesn't depend on Amos. Yes, she said. I'm willing. He let out a breath. It was a small thing, a barely perceptible release of something that had been held, the specific exhale of a man who has been more uncertain than he showed, and has received the answer he hoped for, and is not entirely sure yet how to carry the relief of it. He reached out and took her hand. His hands were large and work rough, and entirely unself-conscious about the contact. And hers were dirty from the garden, and she didn't apologize for it. And they stood there in the half-mulched kitchen garden, in the thin November sun, with the cottonwoods bare above them, and the house behind them full of the people they had both, by different and difficult routes, arrived at caring about. You have straw in your hair, he said. I know, she said. She did not remove it. He held her hand, and they stood there for a while, and neither of them said anything more. And the silence between them was not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who have arrived somewhere and are taking a moment to register where they are before they take the next step. The ranch was around them. The garden was under her hands. The winter was coming, and after it, spring, and she had already begun preparing the soil for what she intended to plant. They were married on the second Saturday of December, in the main room of the Whitfield ranch house, in front of a small gathering that included Ruth, the children, Cole, Vera, and 4 neighbors who had made the drive out despite the cold. It was not a large ceremony. Dorothea had not wanted a large ceremony, and Amos, characteristically, had said that whatever she decided was fine with him and had meant it, which she was coming to recognize as one of his more reliable qualities. He delegated the things he genuinely didn't care about and controlled the things he did, and the line between those 2 categories was clearer in him than in most people. The Justice of the Peace from Kessler Flats performed the service in under 15 minutes, which was the right length. Dorothea wore a dress she had made from dark green wool she'd ordered from the mercantile, not new fabric. Exactly. Because she'd asked for the bolt that had been there longest and gotten a better price for it, but good quality, and the color suited her. May had pressed it the morning before the ceremony with an attention to the task that went slightly beyond what the task required, which was its own kind of statement. Cooper stood next to Amos during the service with the particular solemn uprightness of a boy who has been told this is an important occasion and has taken the information seriously. He was wearing his good shirt, and his hair had been combed with a thoroughness that suggested Ruth's involvement. Somewhere during the words being said, his hand found Amos's hand and held it, and Amos let it be held, and Dorothea saw this from across the small space between them and felt it in a place below language. Ruth stood near the back, straight-backed as always, wearing an expression that was not warm in any demonstrative sense and was not cold either. It was the expression of a woman who has come to a decision about something after long resistance and is still in the early stages of living with the decision. Dorothea did not expect warmth from Ruth, not the performed kind. What she had come to understand was that Ruth's forms of warmth were specific and quiet, and usually disguised as something else. And she had learned to recognize them and receive them without making Ruth self-conscious about having offered them. After the ceremony, there was food. Dorothea had made most of it herself, starting the day before, because she could not imagine leaving this particular meal to anyone else, and no one had suggested she should. There was a roasted joint with gravy, bread made that morning, a winter soup from stored roots and the last of the smoked pork, apple preserves she'd put up in October from the ranch's trees, A cake with spices. Spice cake was the thing she had thought about longest. Ruth had mentioned Eleanor's spice cake the first Saturday of every month without fail, dark and dense with cloves or something like cloves. Dorothea had not made Eleanor's cake. She did not have Eleanor's recipe and would not have used it if she'd had it. What she made instead was a version she had known, since before this place existed for her. The one from the card in her grandmother's hand, different spices, slightly different method, its own particular character. It was not better than Eleanor's, and it was not worse. It was different. It was hers. When Ruth took a piece and ate it and said nothing, Dorothea logged this as the highest grade of approval currently available from that direction and moved on. The winter that followed the wedding was the period Dorothea would look back on, years later, as the one where she understood what she had actually built, and what it had cost, and what it was worth. Not because it was easy. It was not easy. Marriage to a man like Amos Whitfield, who had spent years managing everything at arm's length, and had made a series of internal accommodations to loneliness that had calcified into habit, that marriage required more patience than anything she'd done in the kitchen. And the kitchen had required considerable patience. He was not unkind. This was important, and she held it firmly. He was not a man who said cutting things or diminished her in the ways that some men diminish women they've stopped valuing. But he was a man who defaulted, under stress or uncertainty, to silence and withdrawal. And the first time she encountered this in the context of marriage, rather than the provisional trial of the preceding months, she did not handle it well. It was in January. They had disagreed about something that seemed small, the arrangement of a supply order, whether to increase the kitchen stores by a certain amount in preparation for a stretch of weather the almanac suggested was coming. He thought the increase was prudent. He thought the current level was adequate. This was not by any measure a large disagreement, but he had ended it by saying, in the tone of a man who considers the discussion concluded, "The current level is fine," and going back to his ledger. She stood in the office doorway for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen. She made supper, she served it, she was civil throughout. He did not appear to notice anything was wrong, which was its own information. That night, lying in the dark with the wind outside and the house settled into its night sounds, she stared at the ceiling and had a frank internal conversation with herself about what she was going to do about this. She was not going to pretend it was fine. She was not a woman who had come this far by pretending things were fine. She was also not going to stage a confrontation that turned a small disagreement into an argument about something larger, because that was a form of dishonesty too, loading a specific grievance with the weight of everything else and then detonating it. What she was going to do was say the actual thing. She waited until the following morning when the children were at their lessons, and Vera was at the laundry, and the kitchen was quiet. She went to the office door and knocked. Amos looked. "When you ended the conversation yesterday," she said, "by saying the current level is fine and going back to your work, I want you to know that I heard that as you telling me, my opinion didn't matter enough to finish discussing." He set down the pen. The expression on his face was processing rather than defensive, which she had learned to appreciate as a distinction. "That's not what I meant," he said. "I know it isn't," she said. "But it's what it communicated, and I need you to know that, so you can choose what you communicate on purpose, rather than what slips through by default." A silence. "You're right," he said. It came out plainly, without qualification, which was one of the things she had come to respect about him. When he was wrong and saw it, he said so without constructing elaborate scaffolding around the admission. "I know it's a habit," she said. "Ending conversations when you've made your decision. It works for the ranch. It doesn't work for this." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." "So what do we do?" she asked. He turned the pen in his hand, the habitual motion of a man thinking. "You tell me when I do it," he said, "the way you just did. And I'll try." He paused, with the particular difficulty of a man making a commitment to something he's not certain he can deliver with consistency. "I'll try to stay in the conversation." "That's fair," she said. "And the supply order," he said. "What about it?" "Increase it," he said. "You were right about the weather." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said thank you, and went back to the kitchen. It was not the last time they had this category of difficulty. Marriage is not a problem you solve once, and then have done with it. Is a condition you maintain, like a garden or a working piece of equipment, through consistent small attention and the occasional significant repair. What changed was that they both knew, after January, that naming the problem directly was available to them, that it would not end in catastrophe or retribution, that the other person could be told an honest thing and would try to work with it rather than against it. This was not nothing. In Dorothea's experience, it was quite a lot. Spring came slowly that year. False starts in February that retreated to frost, then a genuine thaw in March that held and deepened into the early warmth of April. Kitchen garden woke up, the way gardens always wake up from good preparation deliberately, without drama. The perennials she'd left in place pushing through the straw mulch with the particular confidence of things that know they belong in the ground. Hattie Greer came back in March with a healthy infant and a husband named Pete, who shook Dorothea's hand with both of his and said, simply, "Thank you," with a sincerity so unadorned it was more effective than anything elaborate would have been. She had not charged Hattie. She had not charged any of them. By spring, she had seen 11 women from the surrounding area, and she had charged none of them. And this fact had circulated through the community the way certain facts circulate quietly, without announcement, arriving in people's awareness as something already established, rather than something new. Ruth was the one who raised it formally. She came to the kitchen on a Tuesday in April with the specific manner of a woman who has prepared for a conversation. She sat down, accepted coffee, and said, "I want to talk to you about money." Dorothea sat across from her. "All right, 11 women," Ruth said. "Some of them have means. Nora Fielding's husband runs a profitable operation. The Alcott family is one of the wealthiest in the county." She turned the cup. "You're providing a service of genuine value. Providing it without charge doesn't make you more virtuous. It makes you invisible." Dorothea looked at her. "Invisible," she repeated. "If you don't charge," Ruth said, "you're a charity. If you charge, you're a professional. The difference matters not for the money itself, but for what people understand you to be. A charity can be ignored. A professional cannot." It was, Dorothea thought, one of the most incisive things Ruth had ever said to her, which was significant because Ruth had said several incisive things. "You've been thinking about this for a while," Dorothea said. "Since November," Ruth said. "When you sent the second woman home with herb packets and written instructions and nothing in return." "I couldn't take money from Hattie Greer," Dorothea said. "You know what their situation was." "Hattie Greer, no," Ruth said. "But Nora Fielding? Mrs. Alcott's daughter-in-law, who came in February." She met Dorothea's eyes. "Could have charged them, and you didn't. And now you have established, without meaning to, that your knowledge costs nothing. It will be very difficult to change that expectation now." Dorothea sat with this. "What do you suggest?" she asked. And here was the thing about Ruth Whitfield that Dorothea had taken the longest to fully understand. Ruth was not simply a woman who criticized. She was a woman who prepared criticism as a form of preliminary to assistance. She had not come to the kitchen to point out the problem. She had come because she had thought about it and arrived at a proposal and needed to present the problem first so the proposal would make sense. "A sliding arrangement," Ruth said. "Those who can pay, pay. A modest amount, not so much that it creates a barrier, not so little that it signals the work isn't worth valuing. Those who cannot pay contribute something else. Time, if they have it. Supplies, if they have them. Word of mouth, which everyone has." She paused. "And you keep records. Names, situations, what you advised, what helped. Because what you're building here is knowledge. And knowledge without records is just memory. And memory ends when the person does." Dorothea looked at Ruth for a long time. "You should have been a businesswoman," she said. Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I should have been several things," she said. "This is the situation I am in." She turned the cup one more time. "Will you consider it?" "I'll do more than consider it," Dorothea said. She talked to Amos that evening. He listened. And this time he listened through to the end, without the office door closure. And when she had finished, he said, "Ruth has good instincts." "She does," Dorothea agreed. "The record-keeping especially," he said. "If you're going to do this properly." He stopped, reframed. "Do you want to do this properly?" "As a real thing, not just a household extension." She thought about how to answer this honestly. "I want to do it as what it is," she said, "which is a real thing. Whether it becomes more formal over time, I don't know. But I don't want to do it halfway." "Then do it completely," he said. "If you need supplies, equipment, tell me." He said this with the directness of a man making a practical decision, which was his natural mode, and she received it in the spirit it was offered. "This ranch has resources. What you're doing with them has value. That's a reasonable exchange." She looked at him. "You're investing in it." "I'm investing in you," he said, which is the same thing. It was the most direct expression of partnership he had offered her, and she recognized it as such, and she did not diminish it by requiring more from it than it was. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to his ledger, and she went back to the kitchen, and the house held both of them in its ordinary evening quiet. By midsummer, the tin recipe box on the kitchen windowsill had a companion, a larger box, wooden, that Amos had made himself from boards in the workshop during the long evenings in March when the weather kept the outside work down. She had not asked for it. He had simply appeared with it one afternoon, set it on the table, and said, "For the records Ruth mentioned," and left. She had run her hand over the wood. He had sanded it smooth and fitted a small latch, and inside was divided into sections by thin strips of the same wood. It was not a decorative object. It was a functional one, made with care, which was entirely consistent with the man who made it. She began keeping records, names, situations, what she had observed and what she had suggested, and when she found out, what had helped and what had not. She was not a doctor. She maintained this with clarity in her own mind, and said it to everyone who came, that she was not a doctor, and that her knowledge was practical and generational and limited to its own domain, and that any serious illness required the physician, regardless of what she could offer alongside. But the domain had real width, and she had spent 40 years accumulating what was in it, and putting it on paper made it both more usable and more honest. May read the records sometimes when Dorothea wasn't using them. She did not ask permission. She simply picked up the notebook and read it the way she read everything, with the direct, unself-conscious attention of a girl who does not understand why reading should require an invitation. Dorothea did not stop her. She had decided early on that May's interest was genuine and worth encouraging rather than managing, and she had been right. The girl absorbed things with an efficiency that was remarkable and asked questions that were often better than the ones Dorothea would have thought to ask herself. "Why do you write down when something doesn't work?" May asked. On a July afternoon, the wooden box opened between them and the records spread out. "Most people only record what works. Because the failures are half the information," Dorothea said. "If you only record the successes, you can't see the pattern of what fails, and the pattern of what fails usually tells you something important about why things work when they do." May thought about this. "It's like the charred onion," she said. "You have to understand what burning does to know what not quite burning does." Dorothea looked at her. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." May nodded, satisfied, and went back to reading. She was 13 now. In a few years, she would be the age where decisions about her future would start to become concrete rather than abstract. And Dorothea was aware of this in the background, the way you are aware of weather approaching that hasn't arrived yet. She did not manage May's future. That was not her role, and she would not have wanted it to be, but she made certain the girl understood that what she was learning had value, that knowledge was portable in a way that land and money were not, that a woman with genuine expertise was harder to dismiss than a woman defined entirely by her relationships to other people. She said some of these things directly and some of them by example, and she trusted May to absorb what she was ready for and leave the rest for later. Cooper turned 9 in August, and for his birthday, Dorothea asked him what he wanted to eat rather than deciding for him. He thought about it for 2 full days, which was entirely Cooper appropriate, and then came to her and said, "The broth," from the first time, but with bread to dip in it. "That's it," she said. "That's the best thing," he said with complete seriousness. She made the broth. She charred the onion and cooked the stock for 4 hours and made the bread in the morning so it would be exactly right by evening. And at supper, she set it all out. And Cooper ate with the focused, silent contentment of a boy who has received precisely what he asked for and finds it exactly as expected. Amos watched him eat. She saw Amos watching Cooper, and she saw in Amos's face something she had not seen there before, not just satisfaction, but a kind of retrospective grief. A man looking at his son healthy and hungry and present at the table and understanding, perhaps for the first time clearly, how much of this he had been missing, and how long the missing had been going on before anyone knew how to stop it. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on Amos's hand. He looked at her. She did not say anything. He turned his hand over and held hers for a moment, and then let go, and they both went back to supper, and nobody mentioned it, and it was complete. The fall brought a situation she had not anticipated, and it was this. A man came to the door. Not a woman in need of practical guidance, a man, maybe 60, well-dressed in the way of territorial professionals, who introduced himself as Dr. Harlan Pruitt and said he had come from Millhaven specifically to speak with Mrs. Whitfield. She received him in the main room, which felt appropriate for the formality he was projecting. He sat with the careful posture of a person who has prepared for a meeting. I'll be direct, he said after the initial courtesies. I've heard about the work you're doing. Specifically, the scope of it, the number of women you've seen, the range of situations you've addressed. I've spoken to a few of them. He folded his hands over his knee. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not here to dispute your knowledge or your results. From what I can determine, both are genuine. I'm here because I want to understand it better, and I thought the direct approach was the most honest one. She looked at him. He was a careful man. She thought the kind of physician who had arrived at caution through experience, rather than starting from it, which was usually a better kind. What do you want to understand? She asked. How you learned what you know, he said. Where it comes from. What its limits are, in your own assessment. It was a good question, and she gave it a thorough answer. She talked about her grandmother and the cards in the tin box, and about the decades of attention, and about the careful boundary she maintained between what she knew and what required him rather than her. She talked about the records she kept and why, and she showed him the wooden box and the notebooks inside it. He read through several pages with the focused attention of a man used to reading clinical notes, and his expression shifted as he read a small recalibration, the expression of someone encountering something more organized and more rigorous than they'd expected. These are good records, he said. My sister-in-law suggested it, Dorothea said. She has good instincts about what should be documented. He set the notebook down. I'd like to propose something, he said. An arrangement. I cover a large area too large, frankly, for one physician. There are places I can't reach quickly, and there are situations that don't require a physician, but that need more than a neighbor. He paused. You're filling that gap already, informally. I'd like to formalize it. Not as a medical practice, you're not a physician, and neither of us should imply otherwise. But as a recognized adjunct, someone I can refer people to for specific categories of need, and someone who can refer people to me when things go beyond your scope. Dorothea sat with this for a long moment. You're not worried about the boundary? She asked. Between what I do and what you do. I'm relying on you to maintain it, he said, which based on what I've read in those notes, you have been doing consistently. He met her eyes. The boundary isn't the problem. The gap it leaves is the problem. You're standing in the gap. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to do so with more structure around it. She thought about what Ruth had said. A charity can be ignored. A professional cannot. I'd need to discuss it with my husband, she said. Of course, he said. She discussed it with Amos that evening, and with Ruth, and after 3 days of thinking, she sent Dr. Pruitt a letter accepting the arrangement in principle with specific conditions attached that Ruth had helped her articulate and that Amos had reviewed for practical sense. Dr. Pruitt accepted the conditions without modification. What Dorothea Crane Whitfield now had built, by the time the first anniversary of her arrival in Kessler Flats came around, was not a perfect thing. It was a real thing, which is different, and in most important ways better. The ranch ran well. Amos ran the ranch, and she ran the household, and there were places where these two territories overlapped and required negotiation, and they negotiated them, sometimes well and sometimes badly, and always eventually. He still sometimes ended conversations too quickly by habit, and she still sometimes held things longer than she should before saying them, and they had learned each other's failure modes with the specific intimacy of people who have decided the learning is worth the cost. Cooper was a different boy than the one who had stood in the kitchen doorway in September of the previous year, thin and pale, and looking at a plate with the expression of a child who has forgotten why eating is for. He was not unrecognizable. He was still quiet, still given to long focused attention on specific things, still the boy who believed the parts people threw away were usually the most useful. But he was present in a way he had not been before. He was in his body, engaged with the world around him, genuinely hungry for food and for understanding, and for the company of the people he had come to trust. He had named the 2-year-old horse Warrant, which was an unusual name for a horse, and which Cooper declined to explain the origin of, and Warrant followed him around the barn with a devotion that the other hands had stopped commenting on, because commenting on it didn't make it less true. May was 13 and reading everything, and asking questions that sometimes required Dorothea to think harder than she expected. She had begun spending time with Dr. Pruitt when he came to the ranch, asking him questions with the same direct unself-consciousness she brought to everything. And Pruitt, who had daughters of his own and understood what genuine curiosity looked like, answered her seriously rather than indulgently, which was the right call. What May would do with her life was not yet settled. That was fine. She was 13. The important thing was that the shape of what was possible for her was larger than it had been, and she knew it. Ruth had not become a different person. This was right, and appropriate Ruth was not a problem that needed solving. She was a person with her own particular nature, and that nature included the kind of stubbornness that can be both a difficulty and a strength depending on which direction it's facing. What had changed was which direction it was facing more often. She had become, without fanfare, one of the people the household relied on not for warmth, which was not her register, for the specific kind of clear-sighted practical care that sees what needs doing and does it without requiring the doing to be acknowledged. She and Dorothea understood each other now in the specific way of women who have been in opposition and come through it to something more complicated and more durable. They were not friends in the way of easy friendship. They were something tighter-grained, two people who knew each other's actual nature rather than the performance of it, who had seen each other at the not particularly impressive moments and decided to stay anyway. Cole had settled into a respectful coexistence that occasionally edged toward something warmer on good days and retreated when he was stressed. This was human, and she had no quarrel with it. Vera had become, under the years of improved kitchen atmosphere, a competent cook in her own right, not inventive, but solid and reliable and increasingly confident, which mattered because confidence is the thing you cook from when the recipe fails. And Dorothea herself. She had thought, arriving on that stagecoach with her leather bag and her tin recipe box, and the full knowledge of how she looked to everyone watching, that she knew what she was doing and roughly where it might go. She had known some of it. She had not known all of it, which is the correct proportion for any genuine undertaking. If you know everything about what you're walking into, it's not really walking in. It's just maintenance of something already established. What she had learned in the year since that stagecoach rolled into Kessler Flats and deposited her into a situation that had gone wrong, before she stepped off the platform, was something she could not have put on a card in the tin recipe box because it was not a recipe. It was more like a principle, one of those things that is obvious once you see it and invisible until you do. Things that appear to be failing are often the things that are simply not yet finished. Cooper was not a sick child. He was a child who had not found his way back to the ordinary pleasures of his body after grief had displaced them. The kitchen garden was not dead. It was unmaintained, and dead are different things, the difference being whether care is possible. The ranch was not broken. It was cold, and cold is a condition that responds to warmth, not a structural failure. She had not fixed the Whitfield ranch. Fixed implies a problem and a solution. And the reality was more iterative than that you attend to a thing consistently and with genuine attention, and it changes, and then you attend to the change, and it changes further, and so on, and it never arrives at a final state because nothing alive arrives at a final state, and the arriving was never the point anyway. The point was the attending. She stood in the kitchen garden on the morning of the anniversary mid-September, the air gone clear and cool in the way of early fall. The cottonwoods just beginning to consider. They're yellow, and she looked at what the season had produced from the beds she'd turned from compacted, neglected earth 11 months before. It was not a spectacular garden. The yield had been practical rather than abundant, and she'd had trouble with the squash beetles in July and had lost more of that bed than she'd wanted to. The herbs on the windowsill were thriving, and the root vegetables had come in solid, and the sage she'd found surviving in the neglected beds when she arrived was large and healthy now, properly pruned, producing steadily. Behind her, in the house, she could hear the ordinary sounds of morning. Vera at the range. May coming down the stairs with the particular quick-footed rhythm she had in the morning before she'd been awake, long enough to moderate it. Cooper, slower on the stairs, his footfall heavier than it had been 11 months ago in the most concrete and literal sense. And somewhere, the sound of Amos moving through the upper hall, the specific tread of a large man trying to be quieter than his natural inclination, which was something he did in the mornings out of consideration for whoever might still be sleeping, which was a thing she had not known about him until she was in a position to hear it, which was its own small testimony to what proximity to a person eventually reveals. Turned from the garden and went back inside. She set water on for coffee. She took the morning's bread from where it had been rising since last night and shaped it and put it in the oven. She checked the temperature of the range with the practiced sense of a woman who no longer needs to think about it consciously, who has internalized the variables to the point where the knowledge has migrated from the deliberate to the automatic. May came into the kitchen. "What can I do?" she asked. Not because she'd been told to ask, but because she'd developed the habit of asking, which is different. "The eggs," Dorothea said. "And don't crack them on the rim, crack them on the flat surface." "You've told me that 7 times," May said. "You still..." Sometimes crack them on the rim, Dorothea said. May made a face and went to the eggs. Cooper appeared in the doorway. Dorothea looked up, and then did the thing she had developed as habit, the small beat of waiting before acknowledging him, giving him the moment to arrive on his own terms. Bread's in the oven, she said. 20 minutes. He sat at his corner. He looked, she thought, like a boy who had decided the world was a reasonable place to exist in, which was not a small thing, and was not a thing that had arrived all at once, but had come the way the garden came incrementally, through consistent, appropriate conditions, until one day you looked, and it was simply there. Amos came in last, as he usually did. He looked at the room, May at the eggs, Cooper at the table, Dorothea at the range with the brief stock-taking pause that she now understood was not an audit but an appreciation, the particular look of a man orienting himself to what matters. He sat down. The Greer boy, he said to Dorothea, and she understood he meant Pete Greer's oldest, who had been helping with the fence line on the north pasture. He mentioned his father might come by this week. About the east section. I'll make sure there's enough for extra, she said. He nodded. The bread came out of the oven. She set it on the table, and Cooper reached for it with the ordinary, unself-conscious hunger of a healthy boy, and May cracked the eggs without being reminded about the flat surface. And Ruth came in and poured her own coffee, and sat with it in the way of a woman who has decided that the kitchen table is a place she belongs. And Amos broke bread and passed it. And the morning settled into its ordinary, imperfect, fully inhabited self. This is what it looks like when something is rebuilt, not from its original blueprints, but from what survives and what arrives, and what can be made from the combination. It is not the same shape as what was there before. It should not be. What was there before was for before, and before is gone, and grieving it honestly is not the same as insisting it return. Dorothea Crane had arrived in Kessler Flats with a leather bag and a tin recipe box, and the very clear understanding that she was not what anyone in that house had been expecting or wanted. She had been right. She was not what they had wanted. She was what they had needed, and the difference between those two things is the distance between the story people tell themselves about what would fix them and the actual conditions under which fixing occurs. It cannot always be the thing someone expects. You can only be what you are, and do the work that is in front of you, and trust that the work itself unglamorous, persistent, done with attention rather than performance is the argument. It was enough. It had turned out to be more than enough. The kitchen was full of the smell of bread and coffee and the beginning of the day. Outside, the cottonwoods held their early yellow in the morning light. The ranch turned slowly on its daily axis, the animals in the barn, and the pastures going about the business of being alive, and in the kitchen at the center of it all, a woman who had come a long way with almost nothing sat at a table surrounded by the life she had built, one day at a time, from what was broken and cold and waiting to be something else. Poured coffee. She passed the bread. Listened to the children argue, briefly and without heat, about something she didn't bother to track. She was home. Not the home she'd had. Not the home anyone would have designed for her from the outside. The home that had been assembled, imperfectly and honestly, from the material of what was actually here. That was the only kind worth having.